Deep into History is independent and proudly listener-supported. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to thank my newest patrons, Corey, Kiana, and Cindy, who went to patreon.com/deepintohistory and attained the rank of historian for just 10 cents a day. A special thanks to Cindy, who generously decided to support the show at an elevated level. Cindy, Kiana, and Corey, my new historians, I salute you and thank you from the center of my being. Consider this a foreword. I feel like I owe you an explanation. As Deep Into History evolved, our episodes became ever longer and more detailed. I found my voice, if you will. One of my very first listeners, who has since become a dear friend, Blake Weatherly, who hosts his own show, Tap Snaps, asked if I could do an episode on the Gallic Wars, Caesar against Vercingetorix, Rome against Gaul. Simple, right? I mean, we've experienced much less well-known tales from our past, and this one has been a lifelong favorite of mine. As I refresh myself with all my old books on the subject, I find myself wanting to share more and more of the story because every action required context. Then said context required context of its own. This led me down an epic historical rabbit hole. 7 months of research and multiple scripts. Hundreds of thousands of words written and rewritten. The scope of the project took on a life of its own. The result? A chronicle that will be presented in many episodes over the coming months. The titanic personalities and egos that were pitted against each other in a deadly struggle for power led me to name the overall series Verses. There will be crossover and tie-in episodes, my homage to the amazing 80s and 90s classic Marvel annuals like the Infinity Wars. Stories that have faded into the background of history will be brought to the fore, in what by the end will be one very long epic. There will be episodes, both long and short, well, short for Deep Into History, in order to stay current in your feeds and to facilitate my rise to the top of the charts. A genre-bending crossing of the Rubicon, if you will, and my chance at an epic roll of the dice. Lastly, I don't believe history repeats itself, but it does rhyme. Over the course of Verses, you will notice alarming parallels to our own time. They should be taken as a warning of what could happen, but not a prediction of what will be. Always remember, the future is in our hands, and we are powerful. Consider that as we go forward, and with that said, this forward comes to an end. This episode was written exclusively to the beat from Rumble by the Wu-Tang Clan, so I'll just throw a W up in the air and say, are you ready? Are you mad inside? Got you strapped down to your seat? Out of the tent flap, arrows rip full clip, Godspeed, approach follow my lead. Fire winds gust, kingdoms crush, full thrust, fall in the whole roll with the rush. Untouchable chunk of talent and soul, my sound waves laid out the back came smoke. Rage, rock, roll, fight, brawl, fall, rumble. Let's go. This is Deep Into History, and I'm your host, Arjun Hundal. Circa 150 before the Common Era, the Republic of Rome stands astride the Mediterranean world like a colossus. After centuries of warfare, they have conquered Italy, Sicily, Carthage, Illyria, Macedon, Greece, Anatolia, and much of Spain. Its legions constantly learning from their enemies' best tactics, making them their own, and crucially, taking to heart every lesson from every defeat they suffered. It would seem like nothing can stop the Roman war machine, and that the Republic would stand forever. But there is a secret known only to a few members of the ruling class, and slowly becoming apparent to a few astute plebs. The Republic, the light of civilization, is dying. The rot has come from within, decades of greed and corruption in the Roman Senate, the importation of hundreds of thousands of slaves to work the estates of the wealthy, has left the citizens of Rome with little hope of making a living. This, paired with a series of demagogues and would-be dictators, has brought the once strong and stable republic to the edge of chaos. It is the time of consuls, tribunes, senators, and epically powerful foreign kings. It is the time of mighty Roman legions, lethal Numidian cavalry, Celtiberian tribes, Cilician pirates, and titanic barbarian hordes. It is a time of greed, corruption, and unlimited ambition. It is the twilight of the republic. And I assure you, my dear friend, the sheer talent, ruthlessness, and charisma of the personalities involved in the dimming of the light makes for some of the greatest history mankind ever lived. And there is no better way to understand Julius Caesar, Pompey Magnus, Lucius Licinius Crassus, not to mention Ambiorix, Dediacus, and Vercingetorix, than to understand the world they were born into, a world that would be ripped apart by the rivalry of two men. It is a time when the gods are real, and the omens they send are considered gospel. It is the year 140 BCE, and in order to truly understand the power of the gods and the way they could dictate the path of a young boy's life, we'll experience it through his eyes. Ready? Then let's go. You cannot fall asleep. You've been laying on your bed for nearly an hour, tossing and turning. For you know tomorrow is a big day, a day of consequence, a day that part of you dreaded. Tomorrow is your 13th birthday, the day you will become a man. In Rome, boys had the luxury of not donning their toga virilis, the white toga of manhood, until they were 15. But life was harsher here in the country. Your small town of Cerate has many families like yours. Equestrians with vast lands to farm, wealthy Roman knights. Though your family's holdings aren't nearly as large as many, you are equestrians in good standing, clients of the ultra-powerful Caecili Metelli clan and its legendary patriarch Quintus Caecilius Metellus Macedonicus, who had completed the subjugation of Macedonia and paraded its king Perseus through the streets of Rome in chains made of his own gold. Maintaining your family's position came at a steep price. Your father was at the beck and call of the Metelli, and could be called upon to join their legions on their military campaigns. Of late, many of Rome's wars had taken years to win, and without your father's legal status as a full citizen to protect your family's interests, unscrupulous members of your order or many of the less powerful noble families would descend on your lands to swindle you out of them, or simply apply market pressure to push you off a financial cliff. Many equestrians had returned home from a victorious campaign only to find their families ruined in their absence. Thus, you had to don the toga virilis early and learn how to defend your family's interests. You can already feel the weight of that awesome responsibility becoming crushing. What is it, Gaius? Are you excited for the feast? Asks a warm and uniquely beautiful voice to your ears. You sit up in bed and see your mother, Fulcinia, standing in the doorway which led to your room in your family's villa. She walks in, sits on the bed, and gently guides your head back to your pillow. Her mere presence lifts the weight off your mind, and in seconds you feel calm. Fulcinia looks into your eyes, and it's as if she can read your every thought. Instead of asking you anything else, she tells you a story. Though she has told you bedtime stories before, many, many times, this one is new. When she says the name Brennus, a chill runs down your spine. A common way to get children to behave in your village and throughout Italy was simply to say, "Be good, or Brennus will come for you." Her story is of a horde of barbarian Gauls led by their king Brennus, who had burst out of the north centuries before. As they came south, they sacked and pillaged every farm, village, and town in Italy. Rome had sent forth its legions, and in a series of battles, every army sent against the barbarians had been annihilated. Brennus and his Gauls had occupied most of Rome for months, all the while terrorizing the population and looting everything they could find. When the few free Romans barricaded in the high sections of the city finally negotiated a single massive payment for the Gauls to leave Rome in peace once and for all, the price was astronomical, 1,000 pounds of gold. The Gauls brought forth a large set of scales to weigh the gold, and the Romans complained that the scales were rigged, for they had weighed out the exact amount of gold before bringing it forth. King Brennus threw his greatsword on the rigged scales, glowered at the Romans, and said, "Vae victis," woe to the conquered. With no choice, the Romans had to melt gold stripped from the temples in the free parts of the city to make up the difference. And when the Gauls left, much of the city lay in ruin, its people killed, fled, or enslaved. Now do you see why boys must become men at so young an age? You nod, and she kisses you gently on your forehead as you feel sleep begin to take you. She gets up. Just before she exits your room, she asks over her shoulder, "Who will defend us the next time the barbarians come, Gaius?" And though you are at the edge of some as yet unexperienced dream, you whisper, "I will." Then you were set adrift on memory bliss of her. Just as you feel yourself become lost in the warm embrace that your mother inspired, you would forever after swear that in the distance thunder rumbled. The next day you had the morning free to devote to your favorite pastime, wandering the hills around Cerate. You had promised your mother that you would be back by noon so you could visit the baths and be properly groomed for the toga ceremony and the huge party and feast that would follow. She had dispatched 2 slaves with you as guards, because in the wooded hills dwelt packs of wild boar, wolves, and even bears. Hating the oversight and wishing to be alone, you had easily lost them in these woods that you knew like the back of your hand. As you walk through the trees, you stop as you suddenly notice that an eerie silence has fallen. Gone are the sounds of birds chirping and the multitude of other small creatures going about their lives. For a few seconds, fear grips you as you think you have fallen into some predator's trap. And then, though it is clear day, you hear a single clap of thunder, and inexplicably there is an eagle's nest at your feet. You have seen eagle's nests before, but always high up in the tallest trees or perched on some inaccessible peak. What is even stranger is this nest has 7 eggs in it. You had never heard of so many in one nest. Even in those rare times you had seen 2 females share a nest, there had never been more than 4. This nest must have fallen from the trees. In wonder, you pick it up and carefully turn for home, thinking that perhaps you can raise the chicks yourself when they hatch. If you could save them and then tame them, perhaps people would call you Gaius Aquila, Gaius the Eagle, like Pyrrhus the Eagle of Epirus. You burst past your confounded guards as you exit the tree line and run across wheat fields. One of your sandals ripped off, but the glorious feeling of your family's soil beneath your toes causes you to pause for only an instant to place a nest on the ground. Rip off your other sandal, retrieve the nest carefully, and then you run as if destiny were calling out to you. 20 minutes later. Panting, drenched in sweat, your feet turned black by the rich soil, you burst through the open gate of your villa and into the central courtyard, where you find your mother reclining while directing the household slaves who are decorating your home for the feast tonight. Your feet slick, you slide to a halt on the marble floor just in time to avoid barreling into 2 slaves carrying a decorated boar's head on a very large silver tray, the centerpiece around which all food and wine would be arrayed. Your father had sent his hunters out to take down the mighty beast, as wild boar is your favorite meat. Fulcinia looks at you, clearly annoyed, and says, "Gaius, I just had the floor scrubbed. You're filthy. Straight to the baths now." Then she sees what you are carrying, and her eyes widen. Her demeanor becomes serious. She asks you how you came by the nest. As you explain, work in the courtyard stops as the slaves gape at the nest. For eagles are sacred to Jupiter. He sees the world through their keen eyesight, and they fly to Olympus to tell Jupiter of the goings-on in his realm. It is sacrilege to harm one. It would bring down the wrath of Jupiter upon your house, and you have just brought 7 mature eggs under your father's roof. As the realization hits you, you begin to understand the shocked silence and worried faces in the courtyard of everyone around you. After you tell her what happened, your mother takes you by the arm and pulls you into the villa proper, forgetting your filthy feet and the trail you are leaving. She takes you into your father's studium, and when he sees the nest, his eyes widen in shock. You repeat the events for your father, and without a moment's hesitation, he stands up and tells you you received an omen, and that he must take you to the Sibyl immediately for it to be interpreted. Your mother protests that the oracle is miles away, deep in the hills, and that you will never make it back in time for the ceremony. Your father brushes her comments off, as if the expense of the feast and missing what was supposed to be the most important ceremony of her life were trivial matters. He tells your mother that this is far more important, and asks her to come with you. You barely have time to slip on another pair of sandals before being ushered out of your villa by your parents. In moments, you are once again walking through your family's fields, headed straight for the forested hills. 4 hours later. Your feet ache, and though the burden of the nest is light, the muscles in your shoulders and arms burn with exhaustion. Your mother had offered to carry it for you, but your father immediately said that the omen Jupiter had sent you was your burden to bear, so you had no choice but to ignore the pain. You are deep in the forest covering the tall rolling hills beyond your village, deeper than you have ever been. The leafy canopy created by the ancient trees of the deep woods is so thick that it has turned what should have been the gentle light of early evening into the complete blackness of night. You are marching up a steep incline, a feat only made possible by the 4 torch-bearing slaves that have accompanied your family. They each also carry heavy spears, capable of killing boars or fending off most predators. This gives you comfort, because the dark forest is alive with strange sounds. You are used to the happy, almost playful noise of the outer forest. Here the noises are different. darker, primal. This leads you to think about the Sibyl, the oracle. Every tale you've heard from the children in your village speak of a hideous old crone who lives in a cave and destroys lives, driving people insane with her visions and prophecies. You do not want this. You are terrified. Just as you can feel you can go no further and want to ask for a break to catch your breath, the incline abruptly yields to flat ground. Your party pushes through some thick foliage and you find yourself in a tiny but well-tended glade, nestled halfway up the hill you had been climbing. The soft grass is centered on a weathered monolith carved with ancient markings you don't recognize. Greek, your mother says as you pass it. She's an oracle of Zeus, a Sibyl of Jupiter. Once you pass the monolith, you see a glowing opening to a cave and a hooded figure standing before it. As your party approaches, the figure throws back the hood, and instead of a hideous crone, it is a bearded middle-aged man. He addresses your father. Those who seek the wisdom of Jupiter must make an offering. Your father hands the man a purse you had seen him fill with a small fortune in denarii at your village. They exchange a few words that you cannot make out, and the man's eyes widen as he looks at you and the eagle's nest you are carrying. He beckons you forward and points into the cave, telling you that you will find the Sibyl inside. A sharp tingle of fear runs down your spine, and you look to your mother, and Fulcinia says, "You must go alone, Gaius. Jupiter's wisdom is for you. You must be brave." Her tone is not reassuring as she clearly sounds worried, for all knew that the words of an oracle could bring ruin. Not wishing to show any more fear than you were already exhibiting, you whisper a quick prayer to all the gods and enter the cave. It is warmly lit, the walls worn smooth with what you now know to be Greek chiseled into the stone. After a few steps, the ground begins to decline, and you follow it into the heart of the hill. Moments later, you come to a round circular cavern. You see its walls have been carved with old images of Greek Zeus and newer friezes of Roman Jupiter, the same god worshipped by different people. A soft and melodic voice comes from the center of the cavern. "I am the Sibyl of Jupiter. Come stand where I am standing, and tell me nothing of who you are or why you have come." You are at a loss for words. She's no old crone. She's beautiful. A woman of no more than 20 years, with the greenest eyes you have ever seen. Her long blonde hair is done in oiled ringlets that sparkle in the torchlight and hang past her shoulders. She wears a flowing gown of fine white cloth that hugs her slim yet curvy figure and almost reveals what's underneath. You feel your cheeks grow hot as a new feeling begins to take hold of you, and you begin blushing furiously. She gives you a warm and enchanting smile and begins to walk backwards, pointing at the black marble slab upon which she had been standing. You stand on the cool circle and hold the clutch of eggs out in front of you as if making an offering. The Sibyl keeps moving away, and when she stops, part of her body becomes blurry. Her gown begins to move and flutter as if caught in a gust of wind. You look down at her feet and see that she is standing astride a long but not very wide crack that runs across the floor of that end of the cavern. She holds out a hand as if telling you to wait exactly where you are and stay silent. She begins to take a series of deep breaths. Her arms flow out to her sides and her entire body begins undulating in the strange vapor as her eyes close. Her motions are strange, alien, unsettling. Yet just as you are about to give in to the desire to run back through the cave to your parents, she speaks to you. You have indeed received an omen from the king of Olympus. The 7 eggs you were fated to find mean that you will attain the pinnacle of power 7 times. She goes silent and continues her strange dance. You think, the pinnacle of power? That could only mean consul of Rome. Then you say out loud, that's impossible. The cavern begins to shake violently. In seconds, it's becoming difficult to maintain your footing on the marble, and the clutch of eggs falls from your hands. You desperately try to grasp it again to prevent the eggs from hitting the ground. Yet it's impossible. You're too slow, and your eyes widen in horror and fear as the clutch lands, and even over the roar of the shaking cavern, you hear the sickening sounds of the eggs crack. In seconds, 7 wet and squealing eaglets have emerged, and they are looking directly into your eyes. You have to look away, so you look up to find the Sibyl being buffeted by a much more powerful stream of vapor coming from the crack. Her gown is flying wildly around her, and her delicate ringlets of hair are flaring out as if they were venomous serpents. Her eyes are still closed as her head stops rocking, and she says in an impossibly deep voice, I determine what is possible. Her eyelids rip open to reveal 2 balls of lightning in place of her eyes. Gaius Marius. The sheer force of the voice of Jupiter Optimus Maximus throws you backwards with untold power. You hit the wall hard, and as blackness takes you, you see the Sibyl fall to the ground, black smoke rising from the sockets of what had once been the most beautiful eyes you had ever seen. Let the magnitude of the words sink in as the awesome presence of the King of Olympus leaves this world. Let the cavern of the Sibyl simply fade away. Come back to deep into history and hear me say, "This is the tale of a man driven on a lifelong quest to fulfill a prophecy. The tale of a bitter rivalry between 2 men that would leave wounds so deep that their city would never fully recover. The saga of many remarkable lives that revolved around the Republic of Rome at the zenith of its power. The dirty wars that are only spoken of with dread. Rome versus Numantia, Rome versus Numida. This is the tale of slaves, plebs, equestrians, and nobles caught in a class struggle so violent that it would lead to dictatorship. Modest reforms have been rejected, blood has been spilt, and soon the streets of Rome would run red with it. The epic tale of Marius versus Sulla, and how their feud would bring their world to its knees. So take a deep breath, let it out slowly, put some smoke in the air if you choose, and let your mind float on my voice as we go deep into the 2nd century before the Common Era and witness the deeds that would doom the Republic to fall to the Empire. Verses Part 1. The Eagles of Jupiter. Welcome. We'll rejoin young Gaius Marius soon. However, to understand the Romans, we must first understand the codes they live by, for it is these codes, rather than the laws offered by the Senate and ratified by the popular assemblies, that truly give us insight into why it was possible for the seemingly strong and stable republic to be bent to the will of ambitious men. It was not always so. Before Rome was the powerful ruler of the Mediterranean, it was a small village that grew to a small town, its people fanatically loyal to their gods, and threatened from invasion by barbarian hordes. For reasons of survival, Roman citizens created a strict and very advantageous code for its people to live by. Though first practiced only by the nobles, it was quickly adopted by the plebs, who learned that if they followed it, they could gain power by becoming clients of the noble families. It became the very fabric of Roman society and provided the structure that led to Roman dominance. Mos Maiorum, the way of the ancestors. It quite literally started at home. Roman families were led by their paterfamilias, the male head of the household, whose rule was absolute, and in turn for the family's loyalty, it was his duty to feed, clothe, and protect them. His sons came next in order of age, and the women of the household had almost no standing unless all the males had died, in which case they usually sought for a more distant male relative to represent them and stand for the family in public. The hierarchy of the family was translated and magnified into the Roman patronage system. Small families would become clients of larger, more powerful ones, that in turn would become clients of elite families called patronus. Just like in a family, there were no signed contracts, just your word and honor, and the patronus, as the absolute head of the network, would look out for the needs of their clients in return for their absolute loyalty. Let's take a moment to learn Mos Maiorum, as it is fascinating and reveals so much about who the Romans were. The code of the way of the ancestors went like this. Fides. Honesty and trustworthiness. Your word was everything. Very important, as nearly all contracts were verbal. Pietas. Dutiful respect for the gods, the homeland, one's parents and family, which required the maintenance of these relationships in a moral and dutiful manner. Religio and cultus. Seeking the understanding of the bond between the gods and mortals to achieve pax deorum, the inner peace that only the gods can offer. One must always practice active observance and the correct performance of rituals to honor and connect with the gods, a lifelong quest. Disciplina, a military virtue. From boyhood, one should strive to devote themselves to education, training, discipline, and self-control, so that when the Republic required your service in the legions, these traits were innate. Virtus, the pursuit of valor, manliness, excellence, courage, character, and self-worth, so that they can be projected on the battlefield, the warrior code of the Romans. Dignitas and auctoritas. Once you had mastered all the previous Mos Maiorum steps and continually exhibited them in public, one would be said to have dignitas. After one had conducted themselves with dignitas for many years, One earned auctoritas, meaning prestige and respect. Most maiorum served the early republic very well, and created the society that by the mid-2nd century BCE was the dominant force in the Mediterranean world. However, by this time, much like the code of the medieval knights and samurai, most Romans only paid lip service to it, and it was only really practiced in a few of the most powerful families because they did not need to struggle to get ahead. This brings us to the rigid class system of Rome, which you can easily picture in your mind as a pyramid. On top were the patricians, wealthy, powerful families that could trace their lineage back to the founding families of Rome. They were arrogant and ultra-elitists because every family under them desired their patronage, because they were the ruling class and provided a disproportionate amount of Rome's leaders, the 1% if you will. They looked down on all below them. Next was a larger, though still small in the context of the overall population, equestrian class. In the early republic, due to its near constant wars, Rome found itself in desperate need of cavalry. So a pact was made with the richest plebeian clans, ones that had enough land to own and support horses. They were granted elite status, Roman knights, an upper class who could deal directly with and even marry into the patrician families and establish client networks of their own from the plebeians or plebs. This comprised the bulk of the Roman population, the 90%. Initially the working poor who struggled to eke out a living on small farms, though by the late Republic, many plebeian families had grown vastly wealthy by being merchants, traders, or in some cases, large estate owners built up over centuries of toil. Below the plebs were the freemen, freed slaves who after long, loyal, and arduous servitude to their masters were granted their freedom. Many were given citizenship and made up the trades and craftsmen of the Republic. Last and least came the slaves, with no freedom and no rights. As you can imagine, over time, the societal lack of upward mobility caused huge problems and unrest in the populace. Thus, the cursus honorum was established, a path to achieve high political office, and a chance for your family to get enrolled into the Senate. It had a set of ages for each position, strict term limits, with each position meant to equip one with the knowledge and experience to ascend to the next step of the ladder. This gave the illusion to the masses that anyone could rise in the Republic. In truth, it was always skewed heavily in favor of the patricians, and only the richest equestrians and a few plebeians could hope to rise. Each position was determined by an election, self-financed and very expensive to run, with no guarantee of victory as each political office was heavily contested. In addition to all their advantages, the age requirement for each position was lower by 2 years for the nobility. It may not seem like much, but remember, these for the most part were already rich families with massive influence, and they had access to positions of great power that were not open to novus homo, new men, those trying to climb the ladder from the outside. The first position, military tribune, an officer of the legions, or military aide-de-camp for provincial governors. New tribunes were elected each year because of the need of officers in the ever-growing number of legions, and each post lasted 10 years. After this term of service, one would be inducted into the Senate, gaining instant elite status. Even running for this relatively low position took large amounts of money. Here the cursus honorum splits into two paths. Patricians and already established members of senatorial families at age 30 could run to become quaestors, who handled the treasury of Rome, legions in action, and each province. This position was highly lucrative in the corrupt late Republic, with many elites using the funds of the state to enrich themselves and their clients with rich government contracts and grants of public lands. The term lasted 1 year, which was more than enough time to vastly enhance one's wealth and influence. This rank was closed to new men, novus homo. Instead, plebs and equestrians could run at age 27 to become tribune of the plebs, one of the most dangerous and powerful political positions in history. A tribune of the plebs, they were always two, had the power to veto bills and policies that the Senate put forth to become laws. Because these positions were so sought after, tribunes would have to win over much of the population of Rome. With the huge numbers of the poor of Rome, the mob as the elite often referred to them, a popular tribune could wield them like a weapon and steer them into great acts of political violence in the late Republic. At age 36, one could run for aedile, 2 noble and 2 plebeian elected each year. This position was nearly always a necessary step to achieve higher office, because they were responsible for the care of city lands such as baths, and crucially the organizing of games and celebrations. It was an extraordinarily expensive position to hold, as the funds required to put on these festivals came out of one's own pocket. The grander the spectacle one put on, the more fame and adoration one would receive from the population, thus giving one name recognition across Rome and throughout the provinces. Now come the truly powerful positions in a military sense, for all the next steps up the political ladder had imperium, meaning the right to command legions. At age 39, one could run to be elected praetor, the generals of Rome, and the chief justices of the provinces. 8 were elected each year. Defeating an enemy could bring vast wealth and undying fame. With just 1 year to accomplish this, you can understand why Roman generals were hyper-aggressive, because a successful praetor could become consul, the 2 most powerful men in the Republic, and among the most powerful political positions mankind has ever created. Consuls were the co-rulers of Rome, and usually elected with a mandate from the Senate, a set of goals that they were to achieve, largely outside of Rome itself, for example, defeating a foreign enemy. After successful service, consuls could become censors, a 2-year position described as the supervisor of public morality. This was a politically powerful position, as censors could add or remove people from the Senate and could hand out the richest publicani contracts for massive infrastructure projects. The gifts one received for both of these were astronomical, and in the late Republic, serving just part of a term could bring in enough gold and bribes to guarantee the prominence of your family for generations. In times of emergency, the consuls and Senate could appoint a dictator. Dictators had unlimited power and all the resources of the state to achieve a single goal or objective, usually only enacted in extreme emergencies to save Rome itself from invasion, for example during the Second Punic War, when Rome thought Hannibal and his army would soon be at the gates. For your knowledge, when you hear the word pro added to a title, for example pro-praetor or pro-consul, it means that one had already served in the position and was asked to or needed to serve again. This was almost exclusively done for those serving in the provinces. Rome was governed thusly. The Senate handled all matters of making war and foreign policy. They would also submit legislation that the elites wished to be passed into law for matters of local and provincial policy. These would be voted on by the General Assembly of the plebs. These were divided into groups, based on the original 35 plebeian tribes of Rome. A tribune of the plebs could veto any law suggested before it was put to a vote. In addition, tribunes of the plebs could pass their own laws, which usually worked in favor of the lower classes, which in turn the Senate could either ratify or by the late Republic veto. When you add in the different interests of the classes, the massive wealth disparity, and the greed and corruption needed to get nearly any law passed, it was a recipe for, well, our tale to be. One last thing to understand, Roman politics was divided by class interests into 2 groups, not political parties in the way we think of them, but a more loose affiliation. The optimates were made up of the elites, the nobles, senators, and the rich. The populares represented everyone else. These 2 factions were constantly struggling against each other in the late Republic, and though there were far less optimates, their only goal was to maintain their position at the top. The populares had to contend with a diverse set of interests for the rest of the population, with many different goals and ideas of how to achieve them. Thus, the optimates almost always had the advantage. Let's rejoin our child of prophecy. Gaius Marius was born in the village of Cerete, outside of the town of Arpinum, to a wealthy equestrian family in the year 157 BCE. His family were clients of, and thus allied to, the powerful Caecili-Metelli clan. The Metelli's power was only outshone by their proclivity to procreate. The main branch of the family alone had produced 7 sons and 4 daughters, all of whom would extend the family's power and influence. They dominated the cursus honorum in Marius' generation. Gaius Marius received a proper, if rustic, education. This meant that he studied Latin and Roman traditions, but did not receive the classical Greek component that was all the rage for well-to-do families in Rome. A competent, if uninspired student, he excelled at physical activities, such as riding and training with gladius and shield. At age 20, financed by his family, and with the influence of their powerful patrons, he successfully ran for the office of military tribune, the first step of the cursus honorum. Gaius Marius was a novus homo, a new man. For his first post, he was an officer in his patron's army that went to invade the Balearic Islands off the coast of Spain, the lands of the slingers. The islands had recently become the base of all piracy in the Western Mediterranean. Little is known of his actions in this campaign except for one crucial detail. The other officers, all aristocrats, looked down on Marius as a new man. Their constant snobbery irritated the young warrior. The beginnings of a lifelong hatred of the optimates had begun. Thus Marius spent much of his time among the common soldiers and learned how to relate to them and earn their respect on the battlefield. From what little we know of the campaign, it was over quickly. The slingers and pirates had little chance against the legions. Upon his return to Rome, he made clear his disdain for the young noble officers and openly mocked his patron general when he was given the ultimate honor, the name and title of Balearicus, because the campaign had been relatively easy. This soured his relations with his patrons. As such, he was not posted to a plum position, reserved for the sons of much more loyal and powerful families. Instead, he got to fight in the dirty wars. You see, for every glorious Roman war that echoes through history, like those against Carthage and Macedonia, there were dozens of smaller wars. These were nearly as important as the large campaigns, but they were against poor tribes that brought few spoils or little glory. It is tempting to envision the superb legions of Rome simply decimating the tribes. In truth, these wars were brutal in the extreme, and the Romans took massive casualties and suffered defeats. In the next few years of his service, Gaius Marius served as an officer in what would become Gallia Narbonensis, Transalpine Gaul. For context, after the destruction of Carthage, Rome had tenuous control of much of Spain, which the Romans called Hispania. It badly needed a land route to resupply its hard-pressed legions, struggling to maintain control of the fledgling provinces there. So a Roman road was constructed across the south of modern France to connect Italy to Spain. This was done with the cooperation and understanding of some of the local tribes. However, the larger Gallic tribes in the area took exception to this, and Roman supply convoys were constantly attacked and looted throughout this period. Little is known of his part in the early stages of the fighting there, but we can be relatively certain that he fought raiding parties of the Averni, the tribe that would one day be led by Vercingetorix. Apart from the fact that the fighting was exceptionally brutal, the legion there under constant threat of ambush and attack, all we know is that Gaius Marius proved to be an exceptional warrior. While this constant low-level combat was going on, the situation in Spain had become a near disaster. As we approached the year 134 BCE, the delicate peace that had lasted in Spain for a few years was completely undone by greedy Roman tax farmers, along with corrupt and ruthlessly oppressive governors. First the Celtiberians, and then most of the other tribes went into full revolt. Over the course of many years, many Roman armies had been defeated badly, so badly in fact that some in the Senate had proposed abandoning the province entirely. This went against Roman virtus, their warrior code, so instead the Senate decided to send its greatest general, who had briefly served there, knew the lay of the land, and something of the ways of its people. Enter Scipio Aemilianus, who the Senate had broken the cursus honorum tradition in order to have this adopted grandson of the great Scipio Africanus, who had defeated Hannibal, lead the legions of Rome in the Third Punic War. For after a series of reversals in Africa, where the legions were losing badly, the superstitious Romans felt that another Scipio was needed to destroy Carthage once and for all. He was elected consul at age 38. He led masterfully on the strategic and tactical levels, and also proved a peerless diplomat, bringing Rome allies and himself clients. Robbed of its support, Scipio's legions decimated the forces of Carthage. This led to a long and terrible siege, and when the city finally fell, 4/5 of its population massacred, its blocks of 6-story buildings systematically set ablaze so that the inferno lasted 3 days. The city that had stood for nearly 800 years was erased from existence. Perhaps sick at the magnitude of what he, in the name of Rome, had done, he wept. And when an officer came to congratulate him on his victory, Scipio Aemilianus looked at the burning city and spoke aloud this verse from the Iliad, lamenting the future fall of Troy. The day shall come in which our sacred Troy and Priam, and the people over whom spear-bearing Priam rules, shall all perish. Meaning for what they had done, he believed they had doomed Rome to one day suffer the same fate as once mighty Carthage. After securing the new Roman province of Africa, he returned home to celebrate one of the most glorious triumphs in Roman history. A triumph was the highest honor Roman society could bestow, traditionally reserved for a conquering general, though by the late Republic, rich families had been buying the honor for winning minor battles by bribing the Senate. This practice had become so common that a law was passed that a general's legion had to kill at least 5,000 enemies before being eligible for a triumph. None could doubt Scipio's accomplishments, and his victorious legions marched through Rome, the population cheering, with days of games and feasting to follow. Scipio Aemilianus rode in a chariot at the head of his legions in parade formation, the people of Rome showering them with flower petals, as they marveled at the art and wealth of Carthage roll by on display carts. All the while, a decorated slave stood beside Scipio and constantly whispered in his ear, "Remember, you are mortal. Remember, you are mortal. Remember, you are mortal," so that he would remember that he owed his victory to the gods and the Republic, and he was not greater than them. Scipio's fame in the years after never dwindled, and he tried his hand at politics, always coming down hard in defense of the optimates, though he did ensure that the men who served in his legions in Africa were taken care of. He was also patron to a huge amount of clients, including the king of Numidia, who he had befriended while on campaign. He seems to have disliked the constant intrigue and backstabbing in Roman politics, though when he chose to weigh in, his words carried tremendous weight. Thus, when the situation in Spain had become a near total disaster, and none of the other nobles were willing to lead the legions for fear of dying, losing face, and even if victorious, with seemingly little to gain in terms of spoils, he answered the call from the Senate and people, and once again won the consulship. His mandate was one objective: pacify Hispania by destroying the most troublesome tribes, especially the Numantines. Gaius Marius used a family connection to Scipio to become one of his junior officers, a military tribune in his army, and came to Rome to help marshal their forces. Scipio put out the call to his vast network of clients and assembled a legion outside the walls of Rome. Since the war had gone so badly, raising men was proving difficult for the Senate, so Scipio used his status and massive client network to raise his own. People would not answer the call of Rome, but they would answer the call of Scipio Aemilianus. He paid for the legion himself, and men flocked to his banner. Raising a private army broke with tradition and was a very dangerous precedent that others would soon use towards their own ends. As his legion came together, he also assembled his famous personal cavalry unit, the Squadron of Friends. Quite simply the greatest heavy cavalry unit the Republic ever produced. We learned of the legions of the Republic in my episode Pyrrhus the Last Hero, and our tale to be will lead us to go into them in depth. So for now, just understand that a legion in 143 BCE consisted of 4,000 legionaries and a companion legion of specialized support troops provided by allied cities, called ala, where we get our modern word ally from. And when Scipio Aemilianus' personal legion moved, it moved with the greatest companion ala of all time. He sent word to his old friend, Micipsa, the king of Numidia, to assemble an ala consisting of Numidian light cavalry, 12 war elephants, and a small force of African skirmishers to screen for the great beasts. Numidian horsemen were a nightmare to face on the battlefield, as the Romans discovered in every battle in Italy during the Second Punic War. The most specialized and lethal components of Hannibal's great army that had crushed Rome at Cannae were now his to command. With his pieces in place, Scipio set sail with his legion. He arrived in Spain to find the legions holding on to the provinces at half strength, having suffered losses in the previous campaigns. They were completely physically unfit. A legionary's salary was barely a living wage in Rome, but in the far-flung provinces they could live like kings on it, with personal slaves and able to afford local delicacies. Scipio arrived to find several demoralized and depleted legions. These were the survivors of the horrific campaigns against the Celtiberian tribes that had used their knowledge of their land to constantly harass, ambush, and even defeat the legions more than a few times in pitched battle. These legionaries had given themselves completely over to wine, food, and women. Some of them had grown so fat that they could no longer fit in their armor. Around every camp had grown small towns of thousands of merchants, traders, and legions of sex workers. Scipio also found that the men had purchased slaves to handle all of their day-to-day duties. The only upside was that Scipio and Marius were soon met by his requested companion ala from Numidia. Enter Prince Jugurtha, the charismatic, handsome, skilled, bastard nephew of the king. Scipio's call to arms came at just the right time for the king of Numidia. You see, for years Jugurtha had been his heir, but recently his new wife had given birth to 2 sons. Jugurtha was immensely popular with the people of Numidia, and far beyond. Some of his feats leading a band of Numidian cavalry to defend peasant caravans from raiders had already become the stuff of legends in the countryside, a challenge to his legitimate sons. Now with an heir and a spare, the king put Jugurtha in charge of the forces he sent to his old friend. After all, the fighting in Spain had been brutal in the extreme with very high casualties. His now unnecessary and inconvenient nephew could well die in the fighting, so he held a huge feast, publicly wishing Jugurtha well in his first major command, but secretly wishing that he would never see him again. Breaking all protocol, the handsome prince embraced Scipio as if they were long-lost brothers, though they had never met. All the Romans came to love Jugurtha, for he showered common soldiers and officers alike with vast amounts of gold from his near-limitless purse. He was also charming, able to mix with nobles or plebs with incredible ease. Once the campaign began, his horsemen and his elephants proved invaluable in battle, and Jugurtha himself a peerless warrior. So much so that by the time the war ended, poems were commissioned by veterans who witnessed his deeds and had them read in Rome. However, that was in the future. As it stood, the legions were in no shape to fight anyone. Scipio Aemilianus immediately set to work. He ordered all the camp followers and slaves dismissed. His legionaries would make their own food, take care of their own equipment, and train like they never had before. This began with a long series of marchers with full armor and weapons. Each evening, the legions constructed a camp, a wooden fortress with gates, watchtowers, and palisades as if they were in hostile territory. The kind of camp Scipio had deployed while campaigning in Africa during the Third Punic War. Gaius Marius watched this military genius in action and absorbed everything he saw. He watched as Scipio himself rode down the baggage train of mules and horses, inspecting each animal and ensuring that it was in good health. If its load was too heavy, he would have passing legionaries carry the excess. In the morning, he would put the legions and his officers through intense mock battles, encouraging his appointed adversary general every day to defeat him and win his praise. Crucially, he would give the squadron of friends to the opposing general, keeping Jugurtha and his Numidians with him, so that his heavy cavalry would have to innovate to counter the greatest cavalry in the world. This also gave Scipio time to train the young prince in Roman strategy and tactics. The forces Scipio commanded in the mock battles never lost, so he was forced to act as a critical observer, and it was when Gaius Marius was in command that he gave the most praise. Marius stuck to Scipio whenever possible. Through skill, he in essence assumed the role of Scipio's shadow. Each day by noon, the legions had dismantled their camps and were marching again. Even though they were in ostensibly friendly territory, Scipio kept his legions at the march as if battle were imminent, in 3 parallel columns with strict march discipline, and trained them to stop at a moment's notice and turn in formation to engage the enemy. This style allowed the legions to go from men on the march to legionaries in formation in mere moments, designed to largely rob the Celtiberians of their greatest tactic, the surprise ambush. He placed the baggage train in between the columns. This largely consisted of pack-bearing mules, driven by lixi, slaves, 180 per legion, who also took care of the menial camp duties. Within months, through constant drilling, he had turned the legions into professionals. He also used his time to learn the lay of the land and the minds of his enemies. He stopped to speak with locals and allied chieftains, only to discover that he was known to them, not as the sacker of cities as he was in the rest of the world, but as the Roman champion. For you see, the war had been going on for so long that he had started his career as a military tribune fighting in Hispania. During that campaign, the legion he was serving with had arrayed for battle to fight a Celtiberian tribe. The tribe's most skilled warrior, a charismatic nobleman of high rank, rode close to the legions and began issuing challenges to single combat, all the while yelling back to his tribe to look at how pathetic Roman valor was. The tribe roared their approval as they slowly advanced. After a while, the young tribune had had enough. Breaking orders, he rode out to accept the challenge. Both sides stopped to watch. Scipio Aemilianus halted as the 2 warriors took a moment to size each other up. The Celtiberian was tall and heavily muscled, wielding a huge 2-handed battle axe and mounted on a large stallion. The 2 warriors charged, and Scipio was almost killed. However, the blow of the monstrous axe missed him and killed his horse, who he had raised himself since he was a colt, his friend. Aemilianus landed on his feet, drew the ancestral blade of the Scipii, and returned the favor by killing the Celtiberian's mount on his next charge. Thrown from his dead mount, he allowed the warrior to rise and arm himself, and over the next several minutes cut him to ribbons. And when the warrior fell, the legions began chanting Scipio's name. The tribe fell silent, their morale shattered, and were subsequently crushed by the Romans. Celtiberians were a people that valued honor and feats of bravery above all else. The story of the duel spread and became the stuff of legend in much of Hispania. When he arrived in the allied towns, chieftains and their people wanted to meet the Roman champion. Instead of displaying the normal Roman arrogance to provincials, Scipio was humbled and in turn showered them with praise for their loyalty to the Republic and promised them rich reward once this war was won. Through them, he gained access to a local information network that allowed him to truly analyze the situation in Hispania. As he pieced together the strategic situation in his mind, he saw the focal point of all resistance was the city of Numantia. The Numantines, though relatively few in number compared to their neighboring tribes, were ferocious and cunning warriors, experts at ambush and winning pitched battles by selecting the perfect terrain to make up for their limited numbers. Their warriors were required to be masters of two fighting styles, with sword and shield for melee combat, and as ranged spearmen. A generation before, they had laid a perfect ambush on the marching legions and captured 20,000, forcing the Romans to make a humiliating peace treaty and leave their weapons behind in exchange for their lives. The Senate rejected this peace treaty as an insult made from a position of weakness and resumed the war, though as yet the Romans had met with utter failure. Scipio meant to rectify that immediately. From the allied chieftains, he learned that the reason the Numantines had been able to rally so many large tribes to rebel and harass the Romans was that they were expert kidnappers. If a tribe didn't want to cooperate, they would send in their warriors at night and steal the children of tribal nobility as hostages, forcing much larger tribes to do their bidding. This is not to say they did not have natural allies around them. They did, but through the kidnappings, they could cause uprisings in far-flung regions and even ambushes from what had been considered friendly tribes. He also learned that though respected, many Celtiberians saw the Numantines as troublemakers and a constant nuisance. Many tribes would even thank Rome if they were taught a lesson. Thus, once his legions were trained and drilled, Scipio decided to go directly for the spider at the center of the web of rebellion, the tribal city of Numantia. He had at his command 4 legions of roughly 16,000 men, plus their companion ala of another 40,000 men. It was with this massive force that Scipio moved into the interior of Hispania. They marched directly past Numantia, as if taunting them to come out and fight. Vastly outnumbered, the Numantines could only watch from their walls. The legions then went on a controlled rampage, burning the fields of nearby allied Celtiberian tribes so that the region was stripped of food and supplies. On the march back to Numantia, the long and well-ordered column was beset by a large ambush executed by a coalition of tribes led by the Numantines. The legions were attacked from all sides. The drilling and discipline paid off, and Scipio showed his genius. The 3 lines cycled in and out of combat for hours, the center line resting, taking water, and getting ready to rejoin the battle. Ambushes on this scale had nearly always worked, but the new legion's march discipline meant that they weren't a disorganized line as before. The Numantines suddenly found themselves facing the legions of Scipio Aemilianus. The fighting was intense, the tribal warriors were skilled at their craft. Gaius Marius fought like a titan, and afterwards was hailed as the best warrior of his legion. Horse and rider splattered in enemy blood. Jugurtha rode up to Scipio Aemilianus and warned that the rear of the column was about to be overwhelmed, and worse, the elephants were stationed there and taking damage. If the beasts were badly injured, they would run amok and destroy his lines, trampling friend and foe alike. Defeat just moments away, Scipio motioned to a signaler, and a unique trumpet blared. In minutes, the squadron of friends assembled around him, and he led them to the hard-pressed rear. In a series of lightning charges and retreats, very much like Macedonian cavalry of old, Scipio's friends decimated the ambushers and averted disaster. With the countryside in ashes, Scipio led the legions back and divided them into 7 groups. Each one was instructed to build a stone fortress, with a stone building for barracks, at positions he selected around Numantia. These were connected by ditches and mounds topped with wooden walls and siege towers every 100 feet. On each level of the towers were placed catapults and ballista aimed at the walls of the town. When this was complete, they built another wall facing outward. These towers held lookouts and archers in case the allies of Numantia came to aid them. Gaius Marius looked on in awe as he watched his masterful general command and devise his siege tactics, absorbing everything, asking questions, completing his orders to perfection, and slowly becoming part of Scipio's inner circle. Numantia was a strongly fortified hill fort. It also had a river which ran through it. It was soon discovered that the Numantines were excellent swimmers, able to hold their breath for exceedingly long times. They had been sneaking men out to send for aid by swimming the river at night and staying under water when in sight of the Romans. So Scipio ordered that tree trunks secured with rope were to be hung across the river attached to the Roman fortifications on either side. Each trunk was spiked with long blades, and the current of the river kept them spinning. Anyone trying to swim under them would be caught in a meat grinder. Thus, with the fortress ring 10 kilometers long around Numantia complete, a long 8-month siege ensued. Not wishing to assault the walls of Numantia directly, for it would cost many lives, Scipio decided to starve them out. The Numantines launched many large-scale attacks on the walls to break out of the trap, but were repulsed every time. In a commando-style raid, a small unit attacked a single tower and took it. 3 warriors escaped the siege lines and went out into Hispania to call for reinforcements. Jugurtha tracked one to a nearby town, and though its people claimed they had never seen the warrior, he saw weapons and signs that they were preparing for war. For this crime, Scipio ordered that the spear hand of every male of age in the town was to be cut off, and when they left there was a mound of 400 of them. Word of this horrific punishment spread, and no other tribe would dare to come to aid Numantia. As the siege wore on, a great Numantine warrior walked up to the walls of the encircling Romans and challenged Scipio to a duel to decide the issue. Scipio ignored the man, but Gaius Marius knew well the tale of the Roman champion. He was offended at the insults that the warrior was hurling at his general, and in sight of Scipio, rode out to fight the great tribal warrior. By now a seasoned veteran, the squat but powerful Marius made short work of the warrior. From the walls of the siege lines came the cheers of legionaries, and wails of sorrow from the walls of Numantia. Several months into the siege, the high chief of the tribe came down to the walls and entered into secret negotiations with Scipio. It was a great risk for the chieftain, for the warrior code of his people did not allow for surrender. However, the supply situation in the town was becoming desperate. His people were beginning to starve. The constant barrage from the artillery on the Roman towers were killing tribesmen every day, and with no food to eat, he feared that his tribe would soon become cannibals. Scipio was a Roman, and battle had been joined, so he could have delivered much harsher terms, but the impassioned plea of this noble and eloquent leader moved him. He declared that he would spare the lives of the Numantines. They would have to give up their treasure and weapons and resettle in lands he would choose for them in coastal territory dominated by Roman power. Numantia would be their punishment. Scipio Aemilianus was known as the sacker of cities for a reason. He'd burn Numantia and wipe the town that had stood for 500 years from the face of the world. The chieftain returned to his people and revealed the price of peace. His warriors immediately killed him, a man they loved. For these people, the relationship between a warrior, his spear, and sword was spiritual. For them, giving up their weapons, many of them storied ancestral blades and spear points, would be to forever lose the respect of their gods, and in essence give up all that it meant to be Numantine, a cultural impossibility. So they marked themselves with their chieftain's blood, and the warrior swore an oath to fight to the bitter end. They launched several new assaults on the walls, but were always repulsed, suffering heavy losses. And within weeks, every Numantine was forced by extreme hunger into cannibalism, eating their slain warriors. A pestilence soon spread across the town. Fearing that they had angered their gods by consuming human flesh, many people began committing suicide. Still, they would not surrender. 7 months into the siege, the atmosphere in the Roman siege lines became celebratory, because it was obvious that victory was assured. At a banquet held in his honor by a sycophantic noble, Scipio was asked where Rome would ever find another general like him. Scipio grasped Gaius Marius by the shoulders and said, "Perhaps right here." As Marius was a novus homo, many of the nobles were shocked to silence by his statement. In the 8th month of the siege, starving and sick, most of the warriors of Numantia committed ritualistic suicide for their failure to prevail and to redeem themselves in the eyes of their gods. The rest, approximately 4,000 survivors, left the town and surrendered to the Romans. All but 50, who Scipio kept to march in his triumph upon his return to Rome, were sold into slavery. And then Numantia was looted for spoils, and was razed to the ground, erased from existence, and all resistance in Spain was erased with it. As for the spoils, they were few. Numantia was not rich like Carthage, so the men were allowed to loot the city and keep what they found. And to compensate the officers, they were allowed to claim mining rights of the nearby hills, which were rich in silver. Because of his superb service, Gaius Marius got his pick and selected 3 plots that had rich veins, securing all the money he would ever need for his political ambitions. Marius marched in Sulla's triumph upon their return to Rome, one that notably lacked the grandeur of past triumphs due to the lack of spoils. During the celebrations afterwards, the legionaries spread tales of Gaius Marius' skill and bravery, and he began to amass the one thing that was vital for a new man to ascend the cursus honorum: fame. Here Scipio exits our tale. Know this about the rest of his short life. He wielded his powerful client network to secure the interests of his class, thus at the expense of the common people. However, he did not enjoy the intrigues of the Senate and would only intervene when the power of the optimates was under threat. He died just 3 years later at age 55 after hosting a dinner party at his home. It was whispered that he was poisoned by a noblewoman for attempting to undo all the reforms for the people that were achieved by the legendary Gracchi brothers, the legacy of her family. Still a hero of Rome, his death was mourned by everyone, even more in the following years, because Rome was going to need its hero, Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus Aemilianus Numantinus, more than it ever had before. In 122 BCE, Gaius Marius successfully ran for the office of quaestor. His newfound wealth gave him the independence from the Metelli that he'd always desired. Though technically unable to run for this office as a new man, his silver allowed the rules to be bent, and gave him the independence from the Metelli that he had always desired. His rhetoric became ever more vitriolic against his former patrons and the optimates in general. To go this far against the most powerful family in Rome shows just how much his interactions with the nobles in the army had changed him. He believed that his fame won on the battlefield would allow him to climb the Cursus Honorum without their aid. The next year he fought in a major battle in southern Gaul. A tribe called the Allobroges became sick of the Roman presence and launched a major offensive in the area. The sources for this battle are very few. What we do know is that the legions won a major victory, killing tens of thousands, and formally annexed the entire region. They set up a permanent trading settlement, Narbo, modern Narbonne, and the province was formally named Gallia Narbonensis. We know Marius conducted himself well. The battlefield was his element, less so the political realm. Over the coming years, he continually tried to run for higher office with mixed and sometimes embarrassing results. The fact of the matter was that without the support of a powerful family, he could go no further. So Marius took the only path he saw for further advancement. His anti-noble stance was hugely popular with the common people, and he was elected tribune of the plebs in 119 BCE. Perhaps driven by the requirements of fulfilling the prophecy, he used his time in this powerful office to heal the breach with the Metelli by passing laws that advantaged the nobility and try to do the same for the assemblies of the people. However, by this time in the late Republic, the two tasks were mutually exclusive. Every law he passed in favor of the people offended the nobility, and vice versa. After his term was over, glad to be rid of the still popular populist, the Senate appointed him as overseer of further Spain, the wild interior of the province, and about as far away from Rome as they could send him. Marius commanded just a single legion, yet he decimated the numerous hill tribes on the border of his province and completely secured it. In the process, he acquired not only more silver mines, but also his own gold mines. He was now rich enough to oppose anyone in Rome and finance the rise of other Novus Homo clients, and begin to fill the Cursus Honorum with them. At around this time, he secured a very advantageous marriage to the Optimate family, the Iulii Caesares. This family, though down on its luck financially, was of the noblest blood of Rome. They could trace their lineage back to the founding families of the Republic. In addition, the house was said to be beloved of Venus and produced the most beautiful offspring. Julia was lovely, educated, brilliant, virtuous, and impeccably well-mannered, a Roman princess. Through her, Marius gained access to social circles that he could only have dreamed of moving in before. And though he was much older, he also adored Julia, and she him. They bonded over their love of gladiator games and their devotion to shared superstitions and mysticism. Their love was genuine, a rarity in the political marriages of the time. From this marriage, her family, the Julii, got a massive influx of silver and gold they needed, and a powerful ally to rise high in the Republic. Julia smoothed some of his rougher tendencies, and used her influence on the social circuit to greatly increase his number of clients and influence among the elite. She was so loved and respected by everyone she met, that people called her Julia Maria, Marius's Julia. Their love soon produced their only child, Gaius Marius the Younger, who would soon be joined by his little cousin, who the world would come to know as Julius Caesar. After his brief overlordship of further Spain was complete, it seemed that Gaius Marius would simply fade away into historical obscurity, having achieved all any Novus Homo could ever dream of. Yet he was driven by the prophecy. Even with Julia by his side, attaining the rank of consul seemed nearly as far away as it ever had, let alone attaining it 7 times. However, his old friend from Numidia came to his rescue in a way. The Jugurthine War begins after this. I hope you are enjoying this episode. I know I enjoy creating them for you, and I could really use your help to keep Deep Into History independent and thriving. Please go to patreon.com/deepintohistory and pledge your support. It's just 10 cents a day, and you'll get to experience the first crossover episode of Versus. You see, while Rome was sending its best warriors to wage war in Africa, a threat came from the far north. It started as tales of untold numbers of barbarians appearing at the edge of the known world and devouring all the small tribes in their path. A lone, blood-soaked German warrior made his way south to a legionary outpost on the frontier. Yet just as he arrived, he succumbed to his wounds, whispering about witches performing mass human sacrifices and bathing in blood. Rome sent scouts to investigate. None of them returned. Legions were dispatched, only to disappear as if they had never existed. For Rome had no idea of the sheer number and warrior prowess of the Cimbri and the Teutons. Join me for a journey into the dark forest beyond the Alps and experience a series of strange events that led to Rome's worst defeat since the Republic was brought to its knees by Hannibal at the Battle of Cannae. Bloodthirsty witches, a sea of barbarians, a stolen treasure that belonged to a denizen of Olympus, and a Roman's greed, all leading to the catastrophic Battle of Arausio, in a tale I call The Curse of Apollo's Gold. Coming soon, only on Patreon. Now back to The Eagles of Jupiter. If ever there was a major war that can be said to truly showcase the greed and corruption, the rot, that was causing the decline of the Republic of Rome, it is the one we are about to experience. Not only does it showcase the structural problems of a society where corruption is the norm, it shows the decline in the quality of the leaders that said society produces. This war also marks the pulling back of the veil, if you will, so that slowly but surely the entire population began to see how utterly corrupt the Republic had become at every level. This war is so important, yet is so very often overlooked as a footnote to history. So in order to move our tale forward, we must first take a step back to witness the best and worst of Roman virtus. There will be many names and dates, but you know I work them in ever so suavely, so just let your mind flow to my voice as we take a journey into the soul of a wild and powerful Roman client kingdom in Africa, the kingdom of Numidia. Ready? Then let's go. According to African legend, deep in the mist of time, the demigod Hercules died in battle in Spain. He had been campaigning with a huge mercenary army made up of units from across the known world. Each nationality owed loyalty only to Hercules, so upon his death, each faction selected their own leaders and dispersed. The Medes, Persians, and Armenians moved south through Spain, built ships, and sailed to Africa, landing on various parts of the north coast. The Medes and Armenians were blown to the Mediterranean coastline in the east, and the Persians far to the west, where they were forced to pull their ships out of the ocean and flip them over to form houses because there was no timber in that land. And forever after, all structures built in what would become Numidia were built to resemble overturned boats, with arches inside resembling the ribs of ships. Unfamiliar with farming, the three groups began to live as nomads, hunting and collecting animals for their herds. Within a few decades, the ancient warriors found one another. Each intermingled and intermarried with a few local tribes in the area. They soon found a large tribe called the Libyans, and unable to understand their language, started first contact through trade. They too soon intermarried, and eventually formed the race we call the Numidians. Having long ago given up the ways of the sea, they one day returned to the coastal areas only to find it dotted with settlements created by Phoenician traders from the far east Mediterranean world, from an area we call the Levant. The relationship was mutually beneficial, for the industrious sailors of what would become Carthage could sell Numidian goods across their growing empire. Ancient Numidia, on the north coast of Africa, consisting much of modern Algeria and parts of Tunisia and Libya, was a nomadic society. While they had a few towns for trade, most of their lives were spent among their vast herds of horses, cattle, and elephants, always on the move for the best pastures. They had a special connection to their animals, especially their horses. From childhood, every Numidian was on horseback. Never using saddles, they instead rode bareback and learned to communicate with their mounts by using pressure from their legs and voice commands. This kind of synergy between rider and horse gave them great advantages and would not truly be seen again until the Mongols burst out of the steppe millennia later. As their society progressed, so too did their animal husbandry. They perfected fighting together in large formations, able to pull off maneuvers that none of their enemies could match. Primarily light cavalry, they fought with throwing spears, charging in, peppering their foes, and retreating, only to turn on a dime and attacking their pursuing foes again and again. In addition, they domesticated and learned how to ride the now extinct North African forest elephant. Much smaller than the huge Indian elephants used by the likes of Pyrrhus of Epirus, these were still formidable. A rider would sit atop, with his legs behind the elephant's ears, and direct the great beasts in the same way they did their horses. Primarily used to trample enemy infantry and break up their formations, they would then be followed by waves of horsemen which would surround the enemy and destroy them at a distance with their throwing spears. As the power of the Phoenician settlement of Carthage grew and it became a major city on the northern tip of Tunisia, it began incursions inland, and the two societies clashed. Many battles were fought, but soon it became clear that the neighbors had very little to gain by fighting, and vast wealth for all if they worked together. Numidia became a subordinate ally of Carthage, and provided their horsemen and elephants to the growing military power in exchange for markets for their goods. They were expert hunters, and lion pelts and skins of other fierce animals brought them great wealth, and with great wealth came towns, many settlements, and mighty citadels. In the late 3rd century before the Common Era, during the Second Punic War, the legendary Carthaginian general Hannibal used his Numidian cavalry to such devastating effect in battle after battle that the bareback riders of Numidia reached almost mythical status in Rome. They became such a nightmare to face on the battlefield because, though barely armored, their peerless horsemanship allowed them to ride circles around the Roman cavalry. The heavily armored Roman equestrians learned to their dismay that no tactic they used could stop them. With the war going terribly in Italy, eventually devolving into a bloody stalemate, Scipio Africanus, the adopted great-grandfather of our Scipio Aemilianus, convinced the Senate that the only way to defeat Carthage was to invade Africa and take the fight to the enemy. Perhaps the greatest general Rome ever produced, he was also a skilled diplomat. He knew that as long as the Numidians stood with the armies of Carthage, the already monumental task would be nearly impossible. After all, Hannibal had just a few thousand of them. On the African mainland, there were tens of thousands of the most lethal horsemen Rome had ever faced. I'll cover the Punic Wars in the future. For now, let's stick to how it relates to Numidia. Before he departed, Africanus developed a network of spies and men who could bring him information on the peoples of the continent. It was through them that he learned that not all was well between Carthage and Numidia. The Carthaginians had been heavily increasing the burdens of their tribute and taxation on their goods for decades in order to fund their wars. In addition, rather than asking for volunteers, they had in essence forced the king of Numidia, a man named Syphax, to conscript large numbers of his people for the war against Rome. In this case, forced might be overstating the case. Syphax was infatuated with a beautiful Carthaginian woman named Sophonisba. Entranced by her wit and charm, he promised Carthage his undying support and all the blood of his people in exchange for her hand in marriage. The hold she had over the king only grew once they were married, and Syphax soon only represented her interests, the interests of Carthage. This was becoming very unpopular with his people. Scipio learned many other things, including that the Numidians were not now one people, but two tribes, roughly divided between the town and city dwellers and the nomads of the Great Plains. Syphax had stolen the throne from its rightful heir, a young man named Massinissa. Scipio had known Massinissa as the nemesis of the Roman legions, garrisoning what had once been Carthaginian Spain, which he had just conquered in the name of Rome. After surviving the fall of Spain, Massinissa had led a band of 3,000 cavalry and launched a masterful guerrilla war. However, the odds were badly stacked against him, so he and his riders fought their way to the coast, seized ships, and escaped for home. Massinissa returned home to find that his father the king had died and Syphax had seized the eastern half of Numidia, the far more rich and populous half of the nation. To add insult to injury, Sophonisba, the enchantress, had been his betrothed, an arranged marriage made many years before. He had adored and loved her and sent gifts and letters of devotion from faraway Spain. Thus, when Massinissa received Scipio's envoy offering an alliance against Syphax and Carthage, he was more than willing. He and his veterans secretly set out across the countryside, gathering ever more warriors to his cause. He rallied and trained a large force. These were hard men who lived hard lives, not the soft town dwellers at the command of Syphax. Massinissa was a gifted general, and together with his veterans of Spain, molded them into the greatest Numidian riders the world had yet known. When the massive Roman army landed in Africa, Massinissa joined them. As the legions and Numidians trained and learned to maneuver together, the two former enemy commanders came to respect one another greatly and were soon friends. After a huge battle in 203 BCE against the armies of Carthage and Syphax, that poets came to call the Battle of the Great Plains, Massinissa decimated Syphax's forces and drove them from the field, guaranteeing Roman victory. After the battle, a Roman patrol found Syphax alone in the wilderness, and Scipio Africanus had him delivered in chains to Massinissa, who did not harm him. Instead of physical torture, he married his lost love, Sophonisba, in front of the wailing Syphax. The next year, at the definitive battle of the Second Punic War, Massinissa was given command of all cavalry, including the Romans, an honor that is perhaps unique in the history of the Republic. He led masterfully at the Battle of Zama, and again drove off Hannibal's horsemen and took the Carthaginian army in the rear, winning the battle for Scipio and the Romans. With its last great army shattered, Carthage was forced to sue for peace. Massinissa was formally recognized as the one true king of Numidia, friend and ally of Rome, and his family recognized as the eternal friends and clients of the Scipii. All was not well, however. The Senate demanded that his love, Sophonisba, be brought back to Rome and displayed in gold chains in Scipio's triumph as a living symbol of Roman supremacy. Scipio assured his newly sworn brother that no harm would come to her and she would be returned to Numidia safe and sound. The noble Sophonisba told Massinissa that she would kill herself rather than endure the dishonor to her house and to Carthage. Heartbroken, he could not defy his sworn ally, and because he knew that she would indeed find a way to commit suicide even if he had her sequestered, Massinissa rode deep into the wilderness and brought her a poisonous herb that would bring her a swift and painless death. According to legend, he held her and wept as life left her body. Massinissa led a very long life and ruled over his people justly. Through this long period of peace, the population exploded. He devised a code of laws, and many towns sprang up and quickly grew through the wealth that poured in from trade with the Roman world. When he died in 148 BCE, Numidia was one of the richest and most peaceful kingdoms in existence. He was succeeded by his eldest son, Micipsa. It was the perfect choice, as he was already well known in Rome for his service during the Third Punic War, where he had renewed the familial bonds through his friendship with Scipio Aemilianus. Micipsa proved himself a loyal friend of Rome, and in 146 BCE, as Carthage burned in the distance, he was awarded some lands and settlements from the vanquished civilization. Tragedy struck the royal family when both of Micipsa's younger brothers died of disease. One of them was survived by a very young son named Jugurtha. The king had no children of his own, but he took in the bastard boy and raised him as a prince. According to Massinissa's will, Jugurtha was specifically left out of the line of succession because he was born out of wedlock, his mother being a commoner. But Micipsa loved the boy and was contemplating formally adopting him as his son. Even at a young age, Jugurtha was charming, physically beautiful, skilled at riding, and quickly becoming a famed hunter of lions. He did not embrace the lazy court life, but used his time in the palace to study Greek philosophy and Roman history. He was so intelligent that the king often asked for his counsel in important matters. Every inch the grandson of Massinissa and should have been his rightful heir, but fate intervened, and Micipsa's newest wife gave birth to two healthy baby boys in quick succession, Adherbal and Hiempsal. Politics and court intrigue in Numidia suddenly became nearly as vicious as in the Greek world. The queen and her family quietly urged King Micipsa to banish Jugurtha. In the darkest halls of the palace, there were whispers about plots to have the young man poisoned or strangled as he slept. The king wished to do no such thing. Not only was Jugurtha loved by the people of Numidia and extremely popular with the army, he also loved his nephew. However, he was constantly being told that should he die, his sons would never be secure on their thrones as long as Jugurtha lived. Jugurtha was now in his late teens and becoming formidable, building a base of power of his own through his magnetic charm and charisma. The king weighed his options carefully. His long years of wait for a natural heir had seen him grow old. He would not live long enough to see his sons grow to full manhood. Jugurtha could be a major problem for them. Just as Micipsa was about to make the most difficult decision of his life, he was saved by a letter from his old friend and patron in Rome, Scipio Aemilianus, requesting him to assemble a companion ala for his personal legion consisting of his finest cavalry, elephants, and skirmishers for what could be a long campaign in Spain. Micipsa was well aware of the fact that the Celtiberians had been delivering vicious defeats to the Romans for years. There had been massive casualties in the brutal fighting. What better way to honor his alliance with Rome than by sending his beloved nephew in command of his forces? After all, there was a strong possibility that Jugurtha would die in the course of the war. As the king knew he would, Jugurtha embraced this honor with joy, for he longed to fight with the legions and equal the deeds of his grandfather Massinissa, thus achieving undying glory. So the king held a huge feast in the city of Cirta to honor his nephew and the brave men making the journey with him. Their horses were given fruit, and their elephants wine, for they were no less the warriors of Numidia. He embraced Jugurtha, and his eyes welled with tears, saying goodbye, hating himself for secretly hoping he would never see the young prince again. As we experienced the Numantine War, I'll just give you a few new tantalizing details of Jugurtha's time there. When he arrived, he immediately became fast friends with every Roman officer, wowing them with his knowledge of the military deeds of their ancestors and telling them the deeds of his. His shrewd mind judged Roman character, and he decided that the way into their hearts was through their coin purses. As a prince of rich and powerful Numidia, Jugurtha had nearly limitless gold, and he ensured that every Roman he befriended, be they pleb or noble, always had a full purse of gold Numidian shekels, stamped with the face of Massinissa on one side and his favored war elephant on the other. He even attempted to befriend young Gaius Marius, a man who made no secret of his loathing for men he perceived to be privileged and spoiled. Yet after training together, leading their separate units, Marius found himself with a growing respect for the young prince. A competition of sorts was forming to outdo one another in excellence because they both desired the attention of Scipio Aemilianus, the sacker of cities, the Roman champion, a man Jugurtha immediately knew he could not bribe. He had to earn this legendary general's respect on the battlefield before he could hope to earn his friendship. While Scipio drilled his battered legions into professionals, Jugurtha led his companion Alla with devastating skill, always carrying out Scipio's orders expertly and exactly. Scipio grew to like the scholarly warrior prince and began to respect his daring and courage. At the same time, Gaius Marius was performing no less brilliantly, and the two young men began to earn the respect of their general. However, Jugurtha's encyclopedic knowledge of military history and his natural ability to apply it in mock training battles quickly found him in Scipio's inner circle, a trusted advisor who aided Scipio in planning the campaign against Numantia. When the war began in earnest, Jugurtha proved himself fearless in battle, leading his cavalry directly, his elephants and skirmishers led by his lifelong friend and second-in-command, the famous hunter Bomilcar. They outshone even Scipio's elite squadron of friends. Jugurtha and Bomilcar covered themselves in glory, and were hailed by all legionaries whenever they walked through the Roman camps. His deeds were so utterly stunning that the reports he sent back to the royal court of Numidia began to resemble tales out of the age of heroes. At the siege of Numantia, Scipio gave him orders to take his riders deep into the countryside and prevent any spies or messengers from ever coming within sight of Numantia, so that though it still stood, to their allies it would seem that Numantia had already been wiped from the face of the earth. The horsemen of Numidia were all hunters in their homeland, men who stalked lions with spears. They turned the night into a time of terror for anyone who approached Numantia, stalking and ambushing would-be reinforcements. The survivors reported back about the ruthless hunters in the woods and tall grasses, and Jugurtha became a name that Celtiberian mothers would tell their children to behave, or else Jugurtha would come in the night to devour them. If there was a difficult task to be done outside of the siege lines, Jugurtha volunteered first every time and succeeded in every mission. He became Scipio's lethal right hand and close friend. It should be noted that during the siege, Jugurtha gave out so much gold to the Romans in the form of gifts that the nobles began assuring him that they would use their influence once back in Rome to ensure that Jugurtha would be made king after the death of Micipsa, and Scipio Aemilianus took notice of these gifts. When the war was won and it was time to dismiss the Alla, Scipio assembled the legions in parade formation, and on a platform in the center he honored Jugurtha as a champion of his legions, hero of Rome, and he presented him with lavish gifts. Then the legions cheered. After the ceremony, Jugurtha accompanied Scipio to his tent, and he gave the young prince a warning about the dangers of bribery. He said that when he returned to Numidia, he should cultivate a relationship with the people of Rome through loyalty and friendship, not by buying influence with his rulers. He said, "It is dangerous to buy from a few what belong to the many. meaning that the people of Rome would come to hate him for bribing their leaders, and if Jugurtha would only wait, his fame would spread across the Roman world, and his talent would ensure that a royal throne would fall into his lap. But if he was impatient and continued his bribery, his gold would be his downfall. Sage advice from a dear friend that should have been taken to heart. Next, he handed Jugurtha a letter to give King Micipsa upon his return home. The two sworn brothers embraced and parted, never again to meet in this world. As soon as he arrived in Numidia, Jugurtha presented himself at the royal palace at Cirta to his uncle and handed him Scipio's letter, which he read aloud to the royal court. Scipio's words: "Your nephew Jugurtha has distinguished himself in the Numantine war above everyone else, which I am sure will give you pleasure. I hold him in great affection for his services, and I would do all I can to make him equally esteemed by the Senate and people of Rome. As your friend, I congratulate you personally. You have in him a man worthy of yourself and his grandfather, Massinissa." This short message said many things at once. It confirmed that all of the reports sent back from the front were true and not self-aggrandizing exaggerations. It also subtly implied that should anything happen to Jugurtha, an accident, a sudden illness, or even if he were struck by lightning, Scipio and the Republic of Rome would take it very personally. Lastly, by mentioning Massinissa as his grandfather, he made it clear that as far as he was concerned, Jugurtha was very much in line for the throne. Jugurtha gave his uncle a lopsided smile, and in that instant, Micipsa saw the boy he knew and loved in the battle-scarred and hardened warrior before him. He rose from his ornate throne and embraced his nephew. Then, with tears in his eyes, he proclaimed to the royal court that Jugurtha, through his actions, had brought glory to all Numidia, renewed and strengthened his kingdom's alliance with Rome, and that he was formally going to adopt Jugurtha as his own son. The announcement shocked the king's legitimate sons, Adherbal and Hiempsal, who were still boys, though they were already the polar opposites of Jugurtha, spoiled princes who indulge in every excess available to the ultra-rich. Adherbal, the elder, was to become a gifted orator with a venomous tongue. Hiempsal, the younger, was cruel and possessed of a low cunning. He would come to revel in court intrigue. Old Micipsa was still in good health, and the land prospered. The next few years passed quietly, until suddenly, in 129 BCE, Jugurtha was summoned to court, only to learn that his dear friend and guardian in Rome, Scipio Aemilianus, was dead. Almost immediately after the devastated Jugurtha left the palace, the brothers began plotting in earnest, for they believed that without Scipio, Jugurtha was left without major allies in Rome. They were wrong. 10 years later. Micipsa was very old. He knew his death was near. He was also no fool. Though his natural sons had tried to hide their plotting and maneuvering, he knew they had claimed the allegiance of the royal court. Jugurtha, never fond of palace life, had spent his time mainly on the plains hunting, organizing patrols, keeping the land free of bandits, and sending gifts of gold to Rome to the men he served with. The villages and the nomads on the vast plains loved him and would answer his call if war came. Tension was running high in Numidia. So he summoned Jugurtha from the plains to attend him before the entire royal court. He beckoned him close, took his hand, and gave one of the great pleas from a father to a son, a king to a prince, that come down to us from the ancient world. Micipsa's words: "You were but a little child, Jugurtha, fatherless and without resource or prospects when I received you into the royal household, in the belief that the obligations under which I placed you would make you love me as much as any sons I might have of my own. In this I was not mistaken, for to say nothing of the fine achievements already standing to your credit, on your return from Numantia you covered me and my kingdom with glory. Your prowess in battle has greatly strengthened the bond of friendship between us and the Romans, and in Hispania you revived the reputation of our family. Furthermore, you have done a most difficult thing. By brilliant success you have silenced the voice of envy, and now, since nature is bringing my life to a close, I earnestly implore you, by this hand of yours that I hold, and by the loyalty that you owe to our kingdom, to love these boys who are your kinsmen by birth, and your brothers by my act of adoption. Do not seek to form unions with strangers in preference to cherishing your blood relations. Neither armies nor hordes of treasure can protect a throne, but only friends. And who can be a closer friend than one brother to another? What stranger will you find loyal if you are the enemy of your own kindred? The kingdom I bequeath to you and your brothers will be secure if you act honorably. But if you prove false, it cannot stand, for concourse turns weakness into strength, whereas by discord the greatest resources are dissipated. However, it is not these boys, but you, Jugurtha, since you are older and wiser, whose duty it is to see that things do not go wrong. Whenever conflict arises, the more powerful disputant, even if he be the victim of injustice, is regarded as the aggressor just because he is the more powerful. Then he turned to face his biological sons, now young men, and said, "As for you, Adherbal and Hiempsal, honor and respect this good man, emulate his virtues, and try hard to give the world no cause to say that my adopted son is a better man than the sons I have fathered." This beautiful and impassioned speech rang hollow. It was too late. Adherbal and Hiempsal were jealous and most likely frightened of their older brother. The old king did little to help. Instead of dividing the kingdom equally between them, or setting up a formal system of rule, his will merely left all of Numidia to his 3 sons. Micipsa died a few days later, and there was confusion about the line of succession. It was decided that the princes should meet to divide the kingdom. Yet at that meeting, the cruel and arrogant Hiempsal hurled insults at Jugurtha, mocking his mother's low birth and calling her a whore. Adherbal calmed his brother down and apologized to Jugurtha for the outburst. Since they could not decide on a division of the land, they decided to meet a short time later at the royal treasury and divide it equally first. It is unclear exactly what happened next. There may have been an assassination attempt on Jugurtha's life, perhaps because Hiempsal's insults about his mother had finally gone too far. But on the night before the treasure was to be divided, Jugurtha had the mansion in which his cruel younger brother was staying in stormed by his loyal friend Bomilcar and a group of warriors. They slew everyone inside and found Hiempsal cowering in a servant's closet, where he was immediately assassinated. This event sent shockwaves across the land and divided the country. The smaller, eastern, but far more populous part of Numidia was horrified by the act and sided with Adherbal. This gave him nearly all the towns and most of the wealth of the rich nation. The nomads of the Great Plains, however, all sided with Jugurtha, believing he had acted in self-defense. They both immediately raised armies, Adherbal's far larger and better equipped. However, Jugurtha had the veterans of the Numantine War, along with thousands of skilled hunters that he had spent years with battling bandits on the borders. When the battle came, Jugurtha's veterans decimated Adherbal's army, largely made up of conscripts and unreliable mercenaries. The prince escaped to the coast and sailed to Rome to make his case to the Senate and ask them to settle the dispute. By right of conquest, Jugurtha was now king of Numidia and sat on the throne of his grandfather, the great Massinissa. But he knew his position was tenuous. If the Senate sided with Adherbal, he could lose everything. So he sent ambassadors to Rome to argue his case. They arrived only days after Adherbal on a ship full of gold and silver. Jugurtha had ordered them to ply his old friends of the Numantine War and any senator that could be bribed with treasure. As this was a late republic, most of the Senate could be bought, and bought they were. Corruption was the norm. Adherbal addressed the Senate, giving an impassioned plea for aid, naming Jugurtha a kinslayer and a bandit who had stolen his birthright. Jugurtha's ambassador spoke next, and told the Senate not to listen to this spoiled and pampered prince. It was the brothers who had plotted, and Jugurtha was only acting in self-defense. They said that Hiempsal was killed by the Numidian people because he had always been cruel. They then reminded the Senate of Jugurtha's service to Rome in the Numantine War, and the esteem in which Scipio Aemilianus had held him. After they left, the Senate debated. The supporters of Jugurtha argued that he deserved the throne because of his service, and Rome was always better off when a known and proven friend led a client kingdom. Had Jugurtha only listened to the sage advice that Scipio had given them at their parting, history could have unfolded differently. Because he didn't need to do this blatant bribery. Scipio and all his men had told tales of his prowess after the triumph for the fall of Numantia. His actions had saved the lives of many of these senators or their sons or nephews. He was a hero of the Republic, loved and honored. For so intelligent a man to ignore his mentor's counsel so absolutely, it is as if Jupiter plucked the memory of that conversation from his mind because it defied his plans. Ever the populare, Gaius Marius was in the streets talking to the crowds of plebs about his respect for Jugurtha, and that Roman virtus demanded that the man who served Rome so well must be made king. If Jugurtha had just shown up in person, without his gold, he would have been met by cheering crowds, and I have no doubt he would have been named king of Numidia then and there. Instead, the ridiculous bribes had begun to stain his reputation. The rest of the Senate, who held themselves publicly as incorruptible, mostly because they already had vast fortunes of their own, said that they were offended by the blatant bribery and called out individual senators for accepting them. These senators replied that they were merely accepting gifts from guests to their homes, which was well within their rights. It was a deadlock. Thus the result was that a commission of 10 senators, who were seen as incorruptible, were sent to Numidia to divide the kingdom between the two brothers. Saying that he would abide by the will of the commission, Adherbal stayed in Rome, terrified of Jugurtha. When they arrived in Numidia, Jugurtha received the incorruptibles as if they were visiting kings, and within a few days he had utterly corrupted 7 out of the 10, through conversation discovering their weaknesses, be it beautiful slave girls, gold, silver, priceless works of art, giving them all their greedy hearts could desire, and more. The commission left, splitting Numidia into 2 kingdoms, almost as it had been before. Adherbal got most of the ports and towns and the area bordering the Roman province of Africa in the east, and Jugurtha kept the plains, the source of his writers. Crucially, because Adherbal was not there to dispute it, when they split the royal treasury, they had no idea that Jugurtha had already moved most of it into a few fortresses in the interior. The sum they saw was so vast as to defy belief, so they had believed it was all there. Jugurtha agreed to the terms, and Adherbal returned. There was initially peace, and Jugurtha used his time to secure an alliance with the neighboring kingdom to the west, Mauritania, modern Morocco. It was an ancient Moorish kingdom, led by its king, a man named Bocchus. To seal their pact, either Jugurtha married his beautiful daughter, or Bocchus married Jugurtha's beautiful daughter. The history books are a bit unclear. With a powerful alliance and his western border completely secure, Jugurtha launched a series of raids into Adherbal's lands, trying to provoke his adopted brother into attacking him. When this failed to achieve results, confident that the Romans did not want to fight a war in Numidia, he gathered his forces and launched an all-out war. Adherbal sent a plea to Rome for help, but none seemed forthcoming. An ancient blitzkrieg, the likes of which the western Mediterranean had never witnessed before, unfolded. Conventional wisdom at the time was that a walled town or mighty citadel could stand for months if well supplied. However, Jugurtha had learned the art of siege from the sacker of cities himself, quickly surrounding towns with palisades and towers, raining down artillery, and then launching direct assaults on the walls in areas he learned were the most lightly defended from his supporters in the towns or men he bribed. Like Pyrrhus or Alexander, he was always first up the siege ladder or rolling siege tower, with Bomilcar right beside him. Once they were atop the walls, the two first fighting with Numidian cavalry spears, and then sword and buckler, at first back to back, and moving away from each other, creating the space they needed for their troops to pour onto the walls behind them. Within a year he had taken all of his brother's towns, except his capital city of Cirta. It was very heavily fortified with high walls and towers, so a long siege ensued. What was different about Cirta is that it had a very large Roman population of pleb and equestrian traders, by some reports making up nearly half the city's populace. With Adherbal's Numidian forces mostly slain or having defected to Jugurtha, it was these Romans and Italians that manned the walls. As they began to watch their families starve, they convinced Adherbal to surrender, guaranteeing him that Jugurtha would not defy the Senate and kill him outright. They also said that they would send messengers to their powerful patrons in Rome and argue his case. With no choice, Adherbal walked out of his city and was immediately tortured to death, his cries clearly heard over the walls and across the city. The Roman traders felt they had little to fear from Jugurtha because to harm them would force Rome's hand, so they threw open the gates. Once again, uncertainty surrounds what happens next. Jugurtha instructed his army to occupy Cirta and only kill anyone bearing arms against them. The problem was that nearly all the Romans had been fighting on the walls and were perceived as enemies, and as a result, a general slaughter ensued. Regardless of his intent, because of this action, Jugurtha had just declared war on the Republic. When news of this atrocity arrived in Rome, the people were angry. This was the point in time where Gaius Marius' political career had become stagnant. Even his marriage to Julia could only take him so far, given the sheer number of enemies he had made among the nobility with the support of populari causes. He was a warrior and needed a war to rise again. As some of his clients and their relations were killed in Cirta, he became the voice of the people's rage, and even had the gates of Rome barred when Jugurtha sent ambassadors to explain. In large part due to his efforts, the Senate and people of Rome voted for war. A consular army was dispatched under a man named Bestia. Yet when they arrived, Jugurtha himself went to meet him. He had to, because the Romans had achieved a quick coup. They had dispatched a ship to Mauritania and warned King Bocchus that if he did not break his alliance with Jugurtha, he would face the full wrath of the Roman legions, and his kingdom would be wiped from the face of the earth like Carthage and Numantia. King Bocchus immediately broke his treaty with Jugurtha and pledged to supply the African legions with grain. Yet because of his familial ties with Jugurtha, he was allowed to remain neutral when war broke out. Without Mauritanian spearmen, Jugurtha lacked the foot soldiers to face the legions directly in pitched battle. So with all the humility he could muster, Jugurtha explained that this was all a misunderstanding. He had not ordered the slaughter of Roman citizens in Cirta. He was Rome's friend. He had no wish to fight them, and that he would pay a large fine to Rome for his transgressions. Characteristically, he also bribed the consul, his officers, and anyone else he could find. The result was a paltry fine considering the crime: a few hundred pounds of silver, a few thousand heads of cattle, and several hundred Numidian horses. He was also required to hand over all of his war elephants, which he did, but had them intercepted while they were being marched away and bribed the legionaries into giving them back. The army remained in Roman territory around Carthage while the consul returned to have the agreement ratified by the Senate. He was greeted with outrage. The populares went crazy, claiming that the corruption of the nobles had gone so far that even the blood of the innocent Romans of Cirta could be bought so cheaply. So the Senate summoned Jugurtha to Rome to stand trial for his crimes in person. He arrived in 111 BCE with a huge entourage and ships full of gold. The trial was to be conducted before the people, yet just as it was about to begin, one of the tribunes of the plebs vetoed the trial. He had taken Jugurtha's gold. Perhaps feeling invincible, Jugurtha made a huge mistake. A grandson of Massinissa had received sanctuary in Rome, having fled Numidia in fear for his life. Jugurtha had Bomilcar assassinate him, but he was discovered and arrested. Late in the night, before the deed was well known in the streets, Jugurtha bribed the guards of the prison and helped Bomilcar escape the city. He had at last gone too far and was ejected from Rome. And as he rode away, he said his most famous words: "A city for sale, and doomed to speedy destruction if it should find a purchaser." Popular opinion in Rome had forever shifted against Jugurtha, and Gaius Marius watched and waited. Remember, though at this time he was not a huge political force, because of his vast wealth from his gold mines in Hispania, Gaius Marius was powerful, with hundreds of clients, and had helped many Novus Homo rise up the cursus honorum. All the while, his beloved Julia Maria was working the social scene, using her charm and eloquence to get her husband back in the good graces of the elite through her now powerful network of Roman princesses. And Gaius Marius would remain well informed of the events in Numidia because many of the young officers were his clients. He knew that the fools the Senate was sending to lead the war against Jugurtha would surely fail, and soon they would have to call upon proven and experienced warriors, and he would surely be at the top of the list. In 110 BCE, they sent the newly elected consul, a man named Albinus, to Africa. He marshaled the 2 legions already stationed there and marched into Numidia. Jugurtha knew Roman tactics and knew that the consul would want to face his forces in a set-piece battle, so Jugurtha and his thousands of riders split up. He let the Romans advance, and his horsemen constantly harassed the marching column, riding up and unleashing waves of throwing spears and then disappearing into the wilderness before the Romans could respond, always leading the largest group himself, his royal guard, his screamers, distinguished by the leopard skins that both mount and rider wore. He attacked the front of the column continually, as if leading them somewhere, because the very sight of him caused the legions to follow. It must have been nerve-wracking for the marching legionaries, never knowing when or where the attack would come, but knowing it would. They were taking low but consistent losses. Finally fed up and exhausted, Consul Albinus had an excuse to go back to Rome when civil strife erupted on the streets because 2 of the tribunes of the plebs that year illegally tried to run for a 3rd term. They had roused their supporters to a fever pitch, and blood was being spilt in the streets. This trip would also allow the consul to try and convince the Senate to extend his command, so he left his brother, the praetor Aulus Postumus Albinus, a Roman failson, in charge of 40,000 men. A very modern term for a very ancient condition. You see, to aid his brother's status in Rome and make his mark on history, our Aulus came up with what he thought was a cunning plan. Actually, let me expand on that. In our dear hopelessly incompetent Aulus's mind, he actually thought that after executing this masterpiece, he would be hailed in Rome as the sacker of cities come again. And why didn't any of the high-ranking officers point out the insanity of this plan, you ask? Well, this is the late Republic, and all the officers of rank were Roman fail-sons as well. Men who owed everything to the situation they were born into and were utterly incapable of ever rising to that position if they had to rely on their own merit. And they were magnificent. Every society produces a few, but the Roman expansion across the known world in the previous 150 years had brought untold wealth to the Republic. This treasure was not used for the betterment of society. Oh no. It was hoarded by the elites, making already rich families into vastly wealthy oligarchs. These were the grandsons and great-grandsons of those conquerors. Never before or after, until the era we are currently living in, had there been so many at one time entering the power structure of society. Think of all the juniors, the thirds, their younger siblings, and if you can do it without shuddering, their children being handed positions of power across the world. Now concentrate all of them in ancient Rome. The wealth disparity between the classes was so vast that they had been raised in societal bubbles where they actually believed they had earned their positions because they were brilliant. But as with all fail-sons, there was a nagging doubt in the back of their minds. They saw the way people looked at them. They knew everyone in Rome thought they were fail-sons, and they needed the one thing that every fail-son in every culture that has existed in all of human history wanted: respect. The cursus Anorum was full of them, with hundreds waiting to take their place, their positions bought by their wealthy families. These people were why Gaius Marius hated the nobility so much. So our dear sweet Aulus's cunning plan, let's call it Aulus Rising, unfolded thusly. In the dead of winter, his legions left their comfortable and well-supplied camps, and began to march on the fortified town of Suthul, where they had heard rumor that Jugurtha stored his vast treasury. The fact that this rumor originated from legionary patrols who heard it from clearly hostile nomads, and that it was confirmed by Numidian merchants and traders among the camp followers didn't have any bearing on its credulity. To Aulus and his officers, the rumor had to be true. Jugurtha's ocean of gold was their destiny. None of the officers seemed to have excelled at cartography, so what they thought would be a 6-day march took 13 long, cold days. The legions constantly buffeted by freezing winds and utterly miserable. Any legion is only as professional as their commanders train it to be, and their march discipline was very poor. Thus the winter was the least of their problems, because any stragglers, or anyone who strayed from the group, were picked off by Jugurtha and Bomilcar leading packs of their best hunters. Tellingly, he did not launch cavalry raids, almost as if he, the apprentice of Scipio Aemilianus, wanted them to continue. And continue they did. Only to find that Suthul was perched on top of a tall circular cliff, rising up in the middle of a frozen swamp that surrounded it for miles around in nearly all directions. From the top of the cliff rose one colossal circular stone wall surrounding the town. This was no mere fortified town like they had heard. Suthul was a Numidian fortress. In times of war, the nomads of the plains and desert needed a place to gather to protect their families and valuables. So they had built fortresses in very defensible positions across the land over the centuries. Jugurtha had recently spent a fortune upgrading Suthul to his specifications. He modeled the walls themselves as stone versions of the siege towers Scipio had encircled Numantia with. The lower levels had slits from which thousands of archers could rain death down from the great height. The next 2 levels housed artillery, Roman-style scorpions, bolt throwers that could pass through 3 armored men standing in a line, along with small catapults. Atop the walls there were more archers, and a number of huge siege ballista that fired a bolt capable of penetrating armored siege towers and eventually bringing them down. A true fortress, Suthul could protect a circle of death around it that could decimate any army foolish enough to attack it. In short, it was one of the most impregnable strongholds of the ancient world, so naturally Aulus ordered the siege to begin. The fortress was fully manned and well supplied, while Jugurtha's army was hidden in the heavily wooded hills many miles away. Aulus's legions boldly conquered the frozen swamp, which the winter rains were quickly turning into a shallow lake, and began the siege. His legions brought up mantlets, rolling screens that gave cover from arrows, and raised a huge siege terrace with many levels and stairs to allow the legions to first scale the precipitous cliff and then the walls. This could be pushed forward on its huge wheels. Jugurtha and Bomilcar, watching from a safe distance, must have laughed at the bumbling attack that followed. The 6 inches of water the legions were now standing in predictably caused the swamp underneath to become something of a quagmire. Not discouraged in the least, Aulus decided to reach for his destiny and ordered a full-scale assault. The mantlets proved far easier to move than the hopelessly large siege tower. Because of the different depths of the muck, units closed in at different speeds. The unlucky first unit to get in range felt the full force of Cthulhu unleashed. A constant rain of deadly arrows, scorpion bolts making Swiss cheese of mantlets and shields, and since the siege terrace was stuck in the muck way out of range, the siege ballista decided to test the accuracy of their range on this first group, their huge bolts leaving bloody ditches where once had stood legionaries. Seeing the first unit be pulverized caused the legions to stop in their tracks, and Aulus was forced to halt the attack. A quote from the ancient historian Sallust: "Jugurtha was well aware that Aulus was a conceited ignoramus, and craftily encouraged his folly, just so you don't think I'm overstating things." Jugurtha decided to play mind games with the Romans. He sent a series of ambassadors, begging them to lift the siege and make peace. When Aulus asked for a meeting with him, he sent back word that he was too scared to face Aulus face to face. Negotiations went on for days. All the while, Jugurtha's army was using the cover of trees in the far distance to move into position, hidden from Roman eyes. They had no fear of Roman scout patrols because they would pass at exactly the same time in the same places every day. When his army was ready, Jugurtha himself appeared on the horizon with a company of Numidian cavalry, making sure the Romans saw them, and then turned and slowly rode away, as if he were abandoning Cthulhu and retreating to the plains. Seeing this as his opportunity to capture him, Aulus immediately raised the siege and his legions followed in hot pursuit. But what they didn't realize was that even before the legions had left Roman-controlled Africa, Jugurtha had placed agents among the horde of camp followers. By now it was completely infiltrated with men and women loyal to him, so he had his agents talk to the centurions, and particularly focused on the units that made up each legion's companion ala. They spread gold around, but most of the non-Roman soldiers were sick and tired of following the orders of Aulus and his officers. They didn't want to die just because their commanders were completely incompetent. As Aulus's legions marched deeper onto the vast plains, entire segments of his army, including most of his cavalry, had agreed to defect to Jugurtha when he attacked. Crucially, he even got the first centurion of the 3rd Legion, the highest-ranking non-commissioned officer, to come over to his side. Thus, late one night, after the legions made their fortified camp, Jugurtha's army surrounded it. A signal, most likely a fire of some sort, was lit. The centurion opened the gate he was in command of, and the Numidians poured into the camp. With the legions taken completely by surprise, many were killed and many more simply fled, including the mighty Failsons of Rome. Of the original 40,000 men, some had died at the siege of Cthulhu, another 5,000 had defected, and in the morning 20,000 men were trapped on a hill in the middle of the plain, completely surrounded by Jugurtha's riders with absolutely no supplies. Jugurtha met Aulus and informed him that he could order an attack and kill them all, or simply wait and watch them all starve to death. The other option was to make a peace treaty, which unconditionally recognized Jugurtha as king of Numidia, and a guarantee that Rome would never invade his lands again. With no choice, Aulus accepted, and also had to consent to his legions undergoing a humiliating ritual. They would have to march under a yoke, an ancient insult that signified the loss of manhood and military prowess. Aulus marched his demoralized army back to Roman Africa. But fear not, the ballad of mighty Aulus Postumus Albinus is not over. He'll reappear in a coming episode, to take his rightful place in the pantheon of history's greatest failsons. When news of this defeat reached Rome, there was panic. At first, rumors swelled out of control that Jugurtha would soon be attacking Italy, a new Hannibal. When it was understood that this would never happen, the panic turned to rage at the Optimates for their utter corruption and bungling of the war. Channeling this anger, the tribunes put forth a bill that would allow the immediate prosecution of anyone suspected of taking Jugurtha's gold, which by this point was most of the ruling class. The bill passed, but the Optimates ensured that 2 of the 3 judges were bought and paid for. Thus no one of consequence was found guilty. Popular anger redoubled. To quell the rage, the Senate rejected the peace treaty outright, and elected a new consul for the coming year that was both competent and incorruptible. In other words, someone so rich that it would be inconceivable that he could be bribed. In the late Republic, this meant drawing from the one powerful elite family that continually and reliably produced great leaders. the Caecili Metelli. Thus, Quintus Metellus won the consulship and command of the war. He was a skilled statesman who served in the legions in the past and was raised with access to his forefathers' accounts of how to train legions and conduct a large-scale campaign. He was also a pragmatist, and he knew he needed Rome's best warriors to defeat Jugurtha. Here we can see the effect of Julia Maria's influence, healing the breach between her husband and his former patronus through their wives. As no one could doubt his prowess in battle, and as something as an olive branch to the populares, Metellus asked Gaius Marius to serve as legate, in charge of one legion. Marius readily agreed. After all, this is what he had wanted all along. They arrived in Africa to find the legions who had served under Aulus in terrible condition, so Metellus spent time retraining them and rebuilding their morale, relying on Marius's advice as to how to best accomplish this. The training, based on Scipio's at Numantia, was grueling, but slowly the undisciplined rabble were drilled into professionals. In the spring of 109 BCE, Metellus' legions marched for war. Jugurtha dispatched envoys to Metellus and also directly to his old friend Gaius Marius, offering peace, telling Marius that he had no wish to fight Rome, reminding him that they shared a bond through their love of Scipio Aemilianus, and telling him that this is the last thing their role model would want. Metellus was at first receptive, though Marius, driven by the prophecy, slowly being consumed by it, knew this war was his last chance at gaining enough fame to run for consul. Now in his 40s, he viewed this war as his last chance. Peace terms were almost reached. However, there was a sticking point that Marius insisted on enforcing. Consul Metellus' mandate stated that Jugurtha had to be brought to Rome to answer to the Senate and people before any treaty could be ratified. And since Jugurtha refused to place his life in the hands of the Romans, no peace could be made. Marius made this point a bone of contention, his voice given gravity because he was a champion of the populares. He explained time and again to the nobles in the command tent that if they returned without Jugurtha, it would appear as if they had been bought, and the Roman people would revolt against their corrupt ruling class. He couldn't be refuted because he was right, almost as if it were indeed the will of Jupiter. Gaius Marius spoke over the senior men in the command tent and made his will be felt. There would be no peace, for now. The legions began their incursion of eastern Numidia. After his victory over Aulus, Jugurtha was more popular than ever, with many Numidians hailing him as Massinissa reborn. Thus every peasant, nomad, or hunter informed him of the movements of the legions. Once set on his course, Metellus decided not to follow Jugurtha around the kingdom as the previous army had. He would take town after town, keeping the initiative while conquering Numidia. This also allowed him to keep moving his supplies forward to his new strongholds, eliminating the long supply lines that had plagued Albinus. Jugurtha had a huge problem on his hands. Each town in Numidia controlled the plains around it in wide swaths. Metellus was no butcher. After he stormed the first few towns, he began offering incredible peace terms. He knew that most eastern towns had been loyal to Adherbal and Hiempsal, and they would eventually go over to Metellus. Thus he had to do the one thing he knew he should avoid, a pitched battle with the legions. For this, Jugurtha had 8,000 of his Numidian cavalry, 2,000 excellent Libyan spearmen of the type that had served Hannibal so expertly, 5,000 mixed skirmishers, all ranged troops, archers and slingers, 84 war elephants, and 5,000 Numidian light infantry, lightly armored, and though devastating warriors in single combat, could not stand for long against disciplined and heavily armored Roman legionaries fighting in a battle line. Then came earth-shattering news. Zaga, one of the only 2 true cities in Numidia, had fallen to the Romans after mounting only a token defense. Metellus had treated the population well, and the citizens were happy the war was over for them. As proof that the Romans had come as liberators and not conquerors, Metellus only left a small garrison behind to man the gates of the city. The news spread across Numidia like wildfire, and Jugurtha knew that many towns now would simply open their gates. These towns were on the eastern edge of the kingdom, neighboring the Roman province, lands that Scipio Africanus had gifted Massinissa for his service. In order for the Romans to get into Numidia proper, they would have to move west, pass a mountain range, and descend into the Maghreb desert. There was only one path through the mountains that was wide enough to accommodate the 35,000 men of the legions and their allies. Both sides knew this was the perfect place for an ambush. Thus Metellus relied heavily on Gaius Marius' knowledge of Jugurtha's tactics to reorganize the line of march to repel a possible ambush. Marius devised a unique column, Rather than have each legion line up together, he broke them up into smaller 500-man blocks, 10 men across and 50 deep. The gaps between them were filled with all the ranged troops from the allied units. Each legionary was required to carry their rations, so that the column did not have to have a large baggage train. This way, the legions could drop their supplies and fight almost immediately, and they would have the covering fire from their ranged units they would need to close the distance with Jugurtha's troops. At the rear, he stationed all the cavalry, so that they could act as a shock force and rush the Numidians wherever the fighting was fiercest, and as a powerful rearguard to protect their route of escape if it came to that. Marius was placed in charge of this force. He also personally formed and trained a small group of cavalry scouts, instructing them on how to spot signs of an ambush and how Jugurtha had executed them in the Numantine War. The legions marched up the pass in eerie silence, the only sounds coming from their marching feet, the few pack animals, and their horses at the rear. All eyes trained on the surrounding inclines, expecting an ambush at any second. Yet nothing happened. They passed the peak of the mountain range and began to descend to the desert beyond. A good way to picture the scene in your mind is the legionary column coming down from the mountain range on the still narrow path, and on either side, for the next few miles, foothills covered with trees and thick brush. Beyond that, the Maghreb Desert, and 18 miles away from the pinnacle of the pass, the only source of water, the Mithul River. And from the great height, the Romans could see that an army was guarding it. Their scouts had ridden ahead and had heard a neighing horse, and then spotted a small group of Numidian cavalry in the trees, who quickly disappeared into the woods as soon as they knew they had been spotted. When the scouts rode back to give their report to Metellus, he dispatched 1/4 of his force ahead to secure part of the river so that they would have water when they made camp that night, and act as a check against the army stationed there. Then he did something strange. He took command of the cavalry at the rear, thus away from Gaius Marius, and placed Marius as a foot soldier in command of the first block of the marching army. Should there be an ambush, Metellus felt that he would be able to command from the rear and direct where the cavalry was needed most, while the proven warrior Marius would give heart to the men in the front. And if there were indeed an ambush hidden in the foothills, the fiercest fighting would be at the front of the line. Now that he had used Marius's knowledge to train his legions, it would be no great loss if his populare rival died. Thus arrayed, at around noon, the legions marched down into Jugurtha's trap. Knowing full well that the bulk of his infantry could not withstand the legions, Jugurtha had split his army in two. Bomilcar was placed in command of the forces arrayed at the Mithul River. He had all the light infantry and war elephants, miles away from the edge of the foothill and clearly visible to the Romans. Jugurtha anticipated that the Romans would have to send a force to secure their water supply, and that it would have to be considerable to counter Bomilcar's forces, who he gave orders not to engage the Romans directly, but to act as a holding force. It would be enough to pin the single legion in place at the river. Jugurtha allowed the legion headed to the river to pass without incident. When the main army had left the mountain pass and was in the valley created by the foothills, Jugurtha gave a signal, and the Battle of the Mithul River began. First, a group of 300 heavy Libyan spearmen rushed in behind the Romans and sealed off the pass, blocking their only avenue of retreat. Then from both sides of the path through the foothills, using the cover of trees and underbrush, never breaking the tree line, his thousands of archers and slingers opened fire on the legions. The first volley alone had legionaries, and especially their lightly armored auxiliaries, dropping like flies. But Metellus's well-drilled legions responded professionally, dropping their supplies, raising their shields, and forming a double line to meet the threat. Then the sounds of blood-curdling Numidian tribal battle cries came from the rear, as Jugurtha's riders attacked the Roman cavalry. He had massed them on both sides of the valley, dropping down to launch their 7 javelins and then rushing back into the protection of the trees, only to reappear moments later to deliver another lethal volley. When the Roman cavalry tried to pursue them into the brush, their horses were completely unfamiliar with the ground and were greatly slowed, some even breaking legs on the uneven ground. The nimble Numidian horses, on the other hand, had been exploring the hills for days and knew exactly where to step to avoid stones, ditches, and how to move through the plant life. The Roman cavalry was being cut to pieces, and the rear was in serious trouble. At the front and along the entire length of the column, the legions were in one of the strangest fights in history, desperately trying to combat a ranged foe largely hidden from view, and when they tried to breach the tree line, they were confronted with small units of Libyan spearmen that had been placed strategically to hold them back. After ensuring the initial attack on their rear was going to plan, Jugurtha, with a small bodyguard of his screamers, was moving up and down the entire length of the combat zone, pushing back any legionaries that were giving his spread-out spearmen trouble. After a few hours, the battle had devolved into a general melee, all sense of order and structure lost. The Romans were finding it impossible to form effective formations against a constant barrage of javelins, arrows, and slingshots. They were taking heavy losses. Metellus' cavalry had suffered the worst casualties, and the rear constantly seemed on the verge of a rout just as evening began to set in. Miles away at the river, the legion sent there, seeing the desperate plight of their main army, was ordered to head back to relieve the column by their commander. At nearly the same time, a rider rode up to Bomilcar, informing him that Jugurtha and his riders were being hard-pressed. Worried for his king and friend, Bomilcar ignored his orders and moved his forces to block the path of the relief legion, a critical error. To make up for the relatively poor quality of his light troops, he broke them up into small squares of men, with the war elephant on the flanks of each square. With 84 of the great beasts, you can imagine how long and thin the line was. And while the elephant would definitely bolster his troops' confidence, knocking down legionaries with their trunks and goring them with their tusks, this is not what they had been trained for, or what they were used for in battle. It robbed them of their primary use, their awesome charge, using their huge mass to break up enemy infantry or wreak havoc on enemy cavalry. Worse, North African forest elephants were smaller and had correspondingly thinner hides than their Indian cousins, meaning they could be seriously injured or even killed by sword and spear. When Bomilcar's line met the legions, they held for only a short time before wounded elephants began running amok, trampling through his own men. Many elephants were killed by the Romans outright. His force was repulsed and badly battered. Of his 84 elephants, only 8 remained with Bomilcar, the rest slain or captured by the Romans. It was now late in the evening at the main battle. Men on both sides were exhausted, yet the fighting continued, particularly at the rear, where Jugurtha himself was leading what looked to be the final rout. He had Metellus himself trapped in what was quickly becoming a circle. Gaius Marius saw this and ran up to a group of 2,000 legionaries who had retreated to a small hill and dropped from exhaustion over the last hour or so. Panting, he told them that if they didn't rise and fight, they would be killed, or worse, experience the humiliation of being captured. He said that he was as tired as they were, but their consul was about to be killed, and this war lost. He asked if they would follow him on one more charge. First a few, then many, then all, stood up and took up their weapons. He formed them into a wedge, a triangular formation, and then charged towards the rear of the battle. The feat he performed next would be emulated by the likes of Julius Caesar, Pompey Magnus, and Marcus Agrippa. Marius, at the point of the formation, charged through the chaos of battle, stabbing, pushing aside, or simply knocking down and trampling enemies in his path. When he reached the rear, he didn't relieve Metellus, but instead pushed on to the force of 300 Libyans that Jugurtha had blocked the legions in with. They were quickly put to flight by his skill and the overwhelming numbers Marius was leading. Then he led his men back into the rear of the Numidian cavalry assaulting Metellus, just as night fell. Jugurtha ordered a fighting withdrawal, and his men executed it perfectly. When the legion from the river at last arrived, it was so dark that they almost attacked their own forces, but realized their error in time and halted their assault. The result of the first duel of the apprentices of Scipio Aemilianus was mixed. The Romans had suffered thousands of deaths, and many more injured. They had lost so much cavalry that they were effectively without it for the rest of the campaign. The few horses that lived had to be used for scouting, yet they had fought through and survived one of the most brilliant ambushes in history. Jugurtha had suffered perhaps a few hundred casualties. The real blow to his army was the loss of most of his precious war elephants. He understood that now the legions were in Numidia proper, with its vast open plains and deep deserts. Keeping his army together would weigh him down and leave him few options apart from a pitched battle. So he disbanded his army, except his royal bodyguard of now 4,000 Numidian cavalry, his screamers, and his surviving Libyan spearmen, and resolved to launch a relentless guerrilla war on the Romans. One thing was clear: Gaius Marius had fought like a titan and led brilliantly. He had saved Consul Metellus' life and kept the battle from becoming a rout. The men of the legions hailed him as Rome's greatest warrior and most able commander. Letters and dispatches sent back to Rome from the front told of his deeds, and the name Gaius Marius was on everyone's lips. His popularity and reputation soared with the people. Meanwhile, back in Numidia, Metellus had decided to march his battered legions to continue the invasion and besiege the city of Zama. Marius argued against this. The legions had almost no cavalry, and the march to Zama would be across miles of open plain and desert, the perfect terrain for Numidian cavalry to launch attacks from. Metellus had sent for more horses from Roman Africa, and as they were only 2 weeks away, it would be better to allow the legions to recover physically and mentally after the grueling battle, and march as a rested and reinforced army. Metellus, jealous at the esteem in which Marius was held by the entire army, ignored him, and sent him off on a resupply mission to a town that had recently come over to Rome. He was ordered to pick up a large shipment of grain to feed the legions at the coming siege. Thus, as Marius predicted, during the march the legions were constantly harassed by Jugurtha and his screamers. Every single one of their remaining scouts, one by one, mysteriously disappeared while on patrol. These were the legion's eyes and ears. Without them, they were effectively blind, surrounded by an ever-growing fog of war. Jugurtha quickly realized where the legions were headed and sent word to the citizens of Zama, warning them, telling them to hold the walls and that their king would not forsake them. Then, leading his screamers, he turned marching at the rear of the Roman column into something akin to a death sentence. The riders would appear seemingly out of nowhere in the distance on the horizon, bellowing their war cries. The legionaries would stop, drop their gear, and lock shields, only to be attacked from the opposite direction by another group of silent riders. The hit-and-run tactics were proving very effective, and had he continued them, the Roman army would have been demoralized and diminished by the time it reached Zama. However, when he learned of Gaius Marius' resupply mission, he decided to spend his guerrilla war on the column to kill his old friend. As far as Jugurtha was concerned, without the heroic actions of Marius, he would have destroyed the legions at the ambush. If he could rid himself of Marius, he was confident that the legions led by Metellus alone would be no match for his skill. In his mind, the proof of Metellus' incompetence was just made clear. He had sent his best warrior and tactician with just 1,000 men on a mission that any junior officer or centurion could have led. So he took the 2,000 screamers with him and rode. In the town, Marius was organizing the convoy to take the grain back to the legions. This involved finding carts and pack animals. Jugurtha arrived to find the gates of the town flung open for him. The populations of most of the towns that went over to the Romans to avoid a siege were of mixed loyalty. In this case, about half the population was loyal to Jugurtha. The other half had supported Adherbal and cursed Jugurtha as a kinslayer. When the Romans and the riders met in the town square, both halves of the population came out of their homes and a general riot began. And just as the apprentices of Scipio were about to duel, they were pushed apart by the sudden swarm of rioters. Marius used the chaos to gather his men and as much grain as they could and escaped from the rear gate, leaving Jugurtha and his men trapped, forced to put down the riot. This gave Marius all the time he needed to get a head start back to the legions. He arrived to find Zama under siege. Metellus had made all the usual preparations, digging ditches and surrounding the town, using textbook, if uninspired, tactics. After the first few assaults on the walls were repulsed, it became clear that the defenders of Zama were well equipped and fierce. The city would not fall easily, so the Romans constructed mobile assault towers and readied themselves for a full-scale attack. Just as this was launched, Metellus was informed that their camp was under attack at the rear of the siege lines. He turned to see smoke rising from burning tents and supplies. Without waiting for orders, Gaius Marius had pulled his troops from the assault and was rushing back to save the camp that held their supplies. Lixi, pack animals, and spare equipment, the life's blood of the legions. Jugurtha had waited for the assault to begin, and when Roman attention was directed at the walls of Zama, his forces made their move. Using the cover of the tall grass of the surrounding plain, Balmulcar led a group of hunters and eliminated the legionaries on the guard towers and walls of the camp with their bows. As soon as they had fallen, Jugurtha and his riders rode up and assaulted the gates, quickly breaking through and unleashing his screamers on the lightly defended camp. When Marius arrived with his contingent, the fighting in the confines of the roads and laneways in the camp became brutal in the extreme. Jugurtha had prepared a surprise for the Romans. As the legionaries formed their narrow battle lines and were about to engage the Numidian cavalry, it appeared that some of their nimble mounts had additional passengers. These were his Libyan spearmen, who dropped from their mounts and formed a phalanx directly in front of the riders. The legions were forced to engage them first, all the while being sniped by javelins thrown with deadly accuracy from the safe riders behind. Each rider only had a few dozen javelins, so the raid on the camp didn't last long, but it achieved its objective. Though Marius had once again saved the legions, Jugurtha had burned enough of their supplies that the siege became untenable, and with winter approaching, Metellus ordered his legions back to conquered eastern Numidia to settle in for the cold months and regroup. And thus, after 3 years of fighting, the Jugurthian war was devolving into a bloody stalemate. The Romans, driven by Vertus, would not leave and only come back stronger each year, while Jugurtha was slowly losing territory and the allegiance of some of his most important towns. In 108, while in their winter quarters, with his stellar popularity in Rome, Gaius Marius raised the idea of running for consul in the elections that would be held at the end of the year with Metellus. He asked that he be allowed to take leave for Rome to organize his election campaign. By any metric, he had served the legions and Metellus himself exceptionally well. Metellus replied that Marius should know his place, and then he pointed at his own 20-year-old son and said that he would gladly support Marius's run for consulship when it was time for his son to run, literally meaning 22 years. But what he meant was Gaius Marius would never be consul. His request for leave rejected, Marius left the tent, whispering an oath that he would one day destroy the Caecili Metelli and cover his face in the cold ashes of their funeral pyres. He took immediate action by writing to his vast network of popularity clients in Rome, having them speak publicly of the incompetence of Metellus, how he was wasting time and resources following a weak strategy. They spread rumors of terrible corruption, like Metellus was secretly taking gold from Jugurtha and intentionally leading the legions into traps. They said that Jugurtha was a true warrior, and it would take Rome's greatest warrior to defeat him. The rumors, gossip, and outright lies spread across the city, and soon many plebs were openly saying that Gaius Marius should be leading the war and that Metellus must be investigated for corruption. This Marian propaganda network served as his campaign for consul in absentia, and made it clear that he was no longer just a rival, but openly hostile to the Caecili Metelli clan and all of their clients. The truth was, especially given the overall low quality of late Republic generals, Metellus was very competent. The campaign was going as well as could be expected against a formidable adversary like Jugurtha. Yet Gaius Marius began spreading his whispers and rumors within the legions in Africa, and soon morale began to plummet. This didn't matter to Marius, fulfilling the prophecy was all. To give you an idea of the intelligence and cunning of Metellus, over that winter, envoys arrived from Jugurtha once again asking to end the war and make a formal peace. These seem to have been genuine. The war was costing Jugurtha and his people dearly. Metellus decided to use his adversary's tactics against him, and gave every envoy huge bribes to arrange the assassination of Jugurtha, all the while keeping the negotiations going, holding out a false hope for peace so that ever more envoys arrived. After a few attempted assassination plots failed, Metellus took a different tactic. He instead bribed the envoys to start rumors that Bomilcar was taking his gold, and had made a secret deal with Rome to kill his best friend and take the throne for himself. To add credence to the rumors, Metellus had caches of Roman coins buried in lands that belonged to Bomilcar, which Jugurtha was informed of and discovered. But what really convinced him that the plot was true was that the peace negotiations had been Bomilcar's idea to begin with. There were even letters found in the home of one of the envoys that seemed to indicate that Bomilcar was at least in contact with the plotters. Bomilcar and all the corrupted envoys were brought before Jugurtha. With tears streaming down his face, Bomilcar denied that this was true, that they were closer than brothers, and he would never betray his king or his country. By this time, Jugurtha had grown paranoid of plots, and was suspicious of everyone. He had his lifelong friend executed, along with every envoy he had sent to the Romans. This event sent a wave of despair across the country. Bomilcar was a national hero, respected and loved. For this infamy, Jugurtha began to lose the support of his people. He was never the same after the execution, unable to trust anyone, and is said to have never been able to sleep properly because he would dream of his dead friend, waking up soaked in sweat and with tears falling from his eyes. The campaign of 108 opened with a battle that quickly turned into a disaster. The bulk of Jugurtha's army fled the field after the initial Roman charge, leaving their king and his still loyal riders in a position where they were nearly trapped. They fought free and retreated deep into the interior of the country. It appears that the army, completely demoralized by the execution of Bomilcar, simply no longer wanted to fight and scattered to the winds. Metellus then carried out his campaign in much the same manner as the year before, systematically taking towns one by one, and though some resisted valiantly, this time Jugurtha was not on the plains harassing the Romans. He had in essence disappeared. Gaius Marius continued to undermine Metellus at every turn, and was able to do so because he continually proved himself indispensable on the battlefield. His popularity and influence with the legions was unequaled, and that coupled with his propaganda campaign in Rome was making the situation between the officers and common soldiers in the camps untenable, as an army could only have one commander. Finally, Metellus, completely fed up and sick of the sight of him, relented and let Marius ride for the coast so that he could sail home and stand in the consular election. Metellus had two reasons to do so. First, Metellus' family had handpicked and massively financed candidates and was hoping to embarrass Marius with a huge loss so that he would be publicly humiliated and all his clients would desert him. He would be a spent force and at the mercy of the all-powerful Caecili Metelli, and they would destroy him. Second, he had secretly learned of the location of Jugurtha and would march and win the war without Gaius Marius, eclipsing all the glory he had won on the battlefield. For Jugurtha was at the spiritual fortress of Thala. Taking it would be a colossal undertaking and Metellus' ultimate test. If he could capture Jugurtha and bring him back to Rome in chains, he would earn the name and title Numidicus, his fame eternal. As soon as Marius left the camps, he began planning his attack. Marius rode hard for the glorious port city of Utica on the coast. When he arrived in the early morning, he discovered the only ship available would not set sail until the evening tides. He ordered them not to leave without him and proceeded to ride out of the city and onto the plains. Always a superstitious man, and perhaps experiencing a moment of self-doubt, he sought a famous African oracle he had heard tell of while on campaign, a conduit to the gods of this great land. Not telling him of the prophecy, he told the shaman that these were momentous times, a time of great personal risk. He needed to know if the gods favored his chances. The shaman told him that the winds of the plains brought a sense of great anticipation flowing from Olympus, and every cast of the bones showed favorable omens. In short, he told Gaius Marius that the heavens were screaming that now was the time to reach for his destiny. Inspired and awed by the words of the old man, he rode back to Utica, boarded the waiting ship, and they sailed out into the Mediterranean with just 6 days until the election. We'll leave Marius on his quest for power for a moment and stay in Africa as the war was about to go ultra hot. After his army fled, Jugurtha gathered his family and rode for the fortress of Thala, the spiritual heart of his kingdom. No Sethul, it still had formidable walls, a powerful natural position being carved out of a solid stone monolith, and it took a 3-day march through parched desert to reach it. Its town, a place of scholarship, mysticism, and spirituality, a repository of the wisdom of the Numidian people that held their sacred knowledge and the mysteries of their religion. The palace held the entire history of their people written on thousands of papyrus scrolls, as well as true-to-life statues of their kings and greatest tribal leaders going back to the mists of time. Thala also held a huge portion of his treasury. It was no wonder that Jugurtha, lost and somewhat broken after he had ordered the death of Bomilcar, would go there to repent and seek spiritual renewal. Metellus took weeks to prepare for the march and assembled the lumber, weapons, and supplies the legions would need for a long siege. It was a gamble because there was no desert in the water for 3 days, and even when they reached Thala, the small oases outside of the town would not fully meet their needs. This meant the legions would need long supply lines with animals laden with water skins constantly resupplying the army. In order to undo all of Marius' rumors of his greed and secret corruption, he declared to his legions that if they executed his orders exactly, Thala would fall and the legions would receive the lion's share of Jugurtha's treasury. This motivated the men and was no loss for Metellus, as his spoils would be the priceless scrolls that contained the very essence of Numidian culture. The Romans were great assimilators of knowledge. Their conquests in Greece and Asia brought not only vast lands and gold, but the accumulated wisdom of the conquered people. The Romans would learn and adopt the best practices, thus becoming more cultured and powerful. Of course, this most heavily benefited the wealthy who could afford to be educated. The prestige Metellus would earn for bringing back this wisdom to Rome would forever make him first among his peers. Prepared and enthusiastic, his legions marched out into the desert. Unbeknownst to the Roman army, they were shadowed by nomads, who sent their swiftest rider to warn Thala of their approach. Warned, Jugurtha saw to the disposition of the defenses. Then the scholars begged him to leave as they could not guarantee the safety of him or his family. Thus he fled, with a heavy heart, into the deep south, the wild regions on the periphery of his kingdom. Metellus arrived and conducted a textbook siege. and raised 2 massive artillery towers to give the legions cover fire as they attempted to scale the walls. The siege lasted 40 days with intense fighting. At last, when a huge Roman ram was pounding on the main gate, the scholars knew that all was lost. So they gathered all of Jugurtha's treasure into the Palace of Wisdom, barred the gates, and held a huge feast with food and wine. Then they lit the palace on fire rather than allow their sacred knowledge to fall into enemy hands. All of the priceless history and philosophy of centuries went up in flames, lost to history forever. Hearing the screams of the burning scholars, most of the inhabitants of Thala joined them and committed ritualistic suicide. Confounded by this act, Metellus led his troops ransack the town for spoils to make up for the now lost gold that he had promised them. When it was over, Thala lay in ruins. To compound his disappointment, a messenger from the coast arrived, bringing shocking news from Rome. With just a few days before the election for consul, Gaius Marius had arrived and entered his name in contention. He then made a series of 7 speeches to the various assemblies of the people. Never a gifted orator, what transpired next must have been even more shocking. Marius delivered a scathing criticism of the social order. He said that the men of the Optimates were only noble because of the brave deeds of their ancestors. They had become lazy, stupid, and corrupt, greedy for gold and land, all at the expense of the well-being of the Roman people. He said that not a single one of their ancestors would be proud of them, and would prefer a man like him to be their heir rather than their wretched offspring. He promised that if he were elected consul, he would strive to gain every advantage for the working people of Rome, and then said that if he were in charge of the Numidian war, he would quickly return with Jugurtha either dead or in chains. The deafening cheers reverberated through the streets of Rome like the sound of thunder. He was elected consul in a landslide, and then had the tribune of the plebs revoke Metellus' imperium, and giving the command of the war to him. Gaius Marius had gained the consulship for the first time, and the prophecy was coming to fruition. Metellus was enraged, and he gave orders that the legions in Africa be disbanded. However, many wished to stay and serve Marius, and at least half the army refused to set sail for home and remained in their camps. Completely frustrated, he marched for the coast and prepared to depart. It was just as well, for since his escape, Jugurtha had raised a mercenary army from the nomads in the south, and convinced his father-in-law, King Bocchus of Mauritania, to join him with a huge army by bribing all of his advisors. They were about to unite and would have cut off Metellus' supply lines had he remained on campaign. In Rome, Consul Marius was having difficulty raising troops, since none of the nobles, and by extension their clients, wanted anything to do with him. Since by law only men with property could be recruited, this left a very small pool for Marius to draw upon. So he had the tribunes temporarily lift the land requirement, and for the first time the poor could join the legions. This had been done in the past, but only in cases of extreme emergency. Marius used his network to spread the word to the masses that this was their chance. The wealth of Numidia was theirs for the taking, and he would ensure that everyone who served him would return rich with spoils, and that they would receive land of their own to farm and build a good life after their victory. Thus his ranks swelled with the poor of Rome. The Senate did not oppose this measure. To the minds of the Optimates this was perfect. Let Marius lead his army of plebs to a disaster, and the people would see that they needed their betters to lead them. They openly joked if Marius should somehow survive the coming disaster, he should receive an ovation for ridding Rome of so much of its riffraff. The key to understanding the significance of the lifting of the land requirement is this. Citizens who own property, however limited, are invested in the state. By definition, they have to be, because it is the state that validates their claim to their property. In Rome, even the lowest common soldier had a small farm. They believed in the divinity of the Republic because they benefited from the system. The working poor had no such physical investment in the system because the system had failed them. These men could become more loyal to a successful general who had led them to modest wealth than to the Republic. And there would soon be many generals who would realize this and exploit it for their own ambition. Marius' new legions began assembling on the field of Mars outside of Rome. He had sent word to the allied cities of Italy to send cavalry, for the war had taken a horrendous toll on the units left in Africa. It was then that a young nobleman who had recently bought himself the rank of military quaestor approached him with a huge smile on his face. He saluted smartly and said that he was ready to serve. Gaius Marius had spent 10 long years grinding his way up the cursus honorum to attain the rank, and he instantly disliked the handsome Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Meaning it as an insult, he ordered him to stay behind and come to Africa once all the cavalry from the Allies had arrived. To his annoyance, Sulla enthusiastically informed the consul that he would see to their training and the cavalry would exceed his expectations when they joined him in Numidia. Marius brushed off Sulla, not knowing that he had just met his future nemesis, or that their personal rivalry would bring the Republic to its knees. Consul Gaius Marius boarded his flagship for Africa and knew exactly where he would strike first, a deed that would silence his critics in Rome, a place that Jugurtha himself had long ago told him was dear to him, in the very heart of the warrior spirit of the Numidian people, the birthplace of African Hercules, home of the cult of the son of Zeus, and one of the most inaccessible and impregnable places in the known world, a place surrounded by a sea of venomous vipers, Capsa. Of course he would take it, for he believed his destiny was Jupiter's will, and our saga has only just begun. Thank you for listening to Deep Into History. I hope you enjoyed the first episode of Verses, the Eagles of Jupiter. Please take a moment to write a review on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcasts. It really helps people find the show. You can follow me on Twitter at Deep Into History. Take care of yourself, my friend. And as always, I truly look forward to the next time we go deep.